There is a moment, in the weeks before a great battle, when the waiting becomes its own kind of war. Men sharpen knives they hope they will never use. Officers study maps of coastlines they have never walked. Sailors stare at horizons that reveal nothing, and yet everything feels close. The salt air, the diesel, the low thrumming of engines somewhere below the waterline. The world holds its breath, and somewhere across that dark water, an island sits in the heat of a Mediterranean summer, unaware that history is already in motion. That island is Sicily. And what unfolds on its shores in the summer of 1943 is one of the most consequential military operations of the Second World War. A campaign involving more than 160,000 Allied troops, hundreds of warships, thousands of aircraft, and a plan so audacious that some of the men who designed it privately doubted it could succeed. It is a story of brilliant deception and catastrophic miscalculation, of generals driven by ambition as much as duty, of ordinary soldiers thrust into extraordinary violence on a stretch of sun-scorched land that most of them could not have found on a map 6 months earlier. And at its heart, it is a story about a single, brutal question that haunted every Allied commander from London to Washington to the beaches of North Africa. Where do you strike when the enemy controls all of Europe and every option carries the risk of ruin? The answer, hammered out in conference rooms and coastal villas and over late-night cables between Churchill and Roosevelt, was Sicily. Operation Husky, the first major Allied invasion of Axis-held European territory. A gamble of enormous scale and the opening move of a chain of events that would shake the foundations of the Axis alliance itself. This is the complete history of that operation. We will follow it from the very beginning, from the strategic arguments that shaped the plan, through the extraordinary deception campaign that helped mask it, to the landings themselves in the grey pre-dawn of the 10th of July 1943. We will follow American soldiers onto beaches at Gela and British and Canadian troops wading ashore near Syracuse. We will watch as German panzer commanders launch furious counterattacks designed to hurl the Allies back into the sea. And we will see those attacks broken, one, by naval gunfire and infantry resolve and the stubborn refusal of exhausted men to give ground they had paid for in blood. We will follow General George Patton as he drives his army across the interior of the island at a pace that stunned even his own officers. And we will follow General Bernard Montgomery as he pushes northward through terrain that seemed designed by nature itself to stop an army cold. And we will watch, somewhere in the middle of all of this, as the political structure of Italy begins to crack. As Benito Mussolini, the man who had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades, is stripped of power by his own king and taken away into a future he never imagined. As a new Italian government begins to make secret contact with the Allies, as German commanders, reading the signs with cold professional clarity, begin preparing to do what they do better than almost any army in history: fight a disciplined, punishing withdrawal, trading ground for time, bleeding the Allies at every mountain pass and river crossing. And at the end, in the shroud of Mount Etna, on the narrow strait between Sicily and the Italian mainland, we will witness one of the war's most debated episodes: the escape of tens of thousands of German troops across the Strait of Messina, slipping away under cover of darkness, even as Allied forces closed in from 2 directions. Whether that escape was inevitable or a failure of Allied nerve and coordination is a question historians have been arguing ever since. We will examine the evidence and let you decide. But before any of that, before the first landing craft grinds against a Sicilian beach, before the first parachute opens over the island's dark interior, we need to understand why this operation existed at all, why Sicily, And why in the summer of 1943? Because the decision to invade this particular island at this particular moment was not obvious, and it was not universally welcomed. It was the product of argument and compromise and strategic calculation stretching back months, fought out among men who understood that the wrong choice could cost hundreds of thousands of lives and potentially lose the war. To understand Operation Husky, you have to understand what the Allies were facing in the early months of 1943. The war had turned. The disasters of 1941 and 1942, the fall of Singapore, the catastrophe at Tobruk, the long retreat across North Africa, were behind them. The Germans had suffered their own catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. The tide, as people were beginning to say, was turning. But turning tides do not win wars. Turning tides require someone to act on them, to channel momentum into decisive military operations before the enemy can recover, regroup, and harden their defenses. The question was where to act, and on that question, the Americans and the British did not entirely agree. The Americans, broadly speaking, wanted to cross the English Channel and hit Germany directly, get into France, drive east, end the war. The British, with Churchill at their most persuasive, argued that the Allies were not yet ready for that crossing, that a premature assault on northwest Europe risked catastrophe, and that the right move was to attack what Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe, strike the Mediterranean, knock Italy out of the war, draw German divisions away from France and the Eastern Front, force the enemy to defend everywhere at once. At Casablanca, in January of 1943, that argument was settled, at least for the moment. Sicily would be the target, the Mediterranean would be the theatre, and the task of turning that strategic decision into an actual military operation fell to a team of planners who would spend the next several months wrestling with one of the most complex logistical challenges the war had yet produced. What they created was imperfect. What they created was contested, revised, argued over, and revised again. And what they created, in the end, worked, at enormous cost, with unexpected complications, and with consequences that rippled outward across the entire remaining arc of the war. If you are settling in for the night, you have found the right place to be. This is a long story, told completely, from beginning to end. Every major decision, every turning point, every human moment, embedded in the larger sweep of a campaign that changed the shape of the war. The narration is designed to carry you gently through it all, unhurried, with the kind of depth and detail this history deserves. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, now is a good moment to do so. We cover the full scope of the Second World War in this format. Long, complete, carefully researched, and Operation Husky is one of the most rewarding campaigns in the entire conflict to spend a night with. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you like. The story will find you. It is the summer of 1943. Across the Mediterranean, 160,000 men are already moving toward an island they are about to change forever. Let us begin. The war had been going on for more than 3 years, and the men who directed it from map rooms and conference tables were beginning to understand something that soldiers in the field had known for months. Winning battles was not the same thing as winning the war. By the early weeks of 1943, the Allied coalition, Britain, the United States, and their partners, had accumulated a string of hard-fought successes across North Africa that would have seemed impossible just 2 years before. The desert campaigns, brutal and costly, had finally broken the back of Axis power on the African continent. But a victory in the desert was not a victory in Europe, and Europe was where the war would ultimately be decided. The question that occupied the highest levels of Allied command was not whether they would cross into Axis-held European territory, but when, and where, and with what forces. The answer would not come easily. It would come from argument, from compromise, and from the cold mathematics of military possibility. Casablanca, on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, was chosen as the meeting ground. In January of 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived there with their senior military staffs, each delegation carrying its own vision for how the war should proceed. The city itself was barely touched by the conflict that had consumed so much of the world. Its white buildings and palm-lined boulevards offered a strange, almost dreamlike backdrop for decisions that would shape the lives of millions. Security was severe. Roosevelt had flown across the Atlantic, the first sitting American president to travel by aircraft during wartime, a journey that carried its own symbolic weight, signaling a commitment to the alliance that went beyond diplomatic correspondence. Churchill arrived with his usual entourage of advisors, his cigar, and his unshakable conviction that he understood the war's geography better than anyone else in the room. The British position was, in essence, a strategy of encirclement and attrition. Churchill had long believed that the way to defeat Germany was not to hurl Allied armies directly at the strongest point of Axis defence, which in early 1943 meant the heavily fortified Atlantic Wall along France's northern coast, but to attack the periphery, drain German resources, and strike at what he famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. For Churchill, the Mediterranean was not a sideshow. It was a theatre of central importance, a sea lane that Britain had depended on for centuries to connect the home islands with its empire in the east. Closing the Mediterranean to Allied shipping had cost Britain enormously in terms of both supplies and time. Reopening it and holding it was a strategic imperative that Churchill pressed with the full force of his considerable persuasive powers. The American position was more direct, and in some ways more impatient. American military planners, shaped by a tradition that prized decisive action and concentration of force, generally favored a cross-channel invasion of France as soon as it could be mounted in sufficient strength. General George Marshall and his colleagues were wary of what they privately feared was a British tendency to defer the decisive confrontation indefinitely, to fight in peripheral theatres while the main event was postponed. They worried that too deep a commitment to the Mediterranean would drain resources from the eventual assault on northern France, and they pressed for a firm commitment to that operation above all others. The tension between these two strategic visions, the British preference for the Mediterranean and the American insistence on a cross-channel strike, ran like a fault line through the Casablanca Conference, and it would continue to run through Allied planning for months to come. What ultimately broke the deadlock was not a grand philosophical resolution, but a simple, practical question: what could the Allies actually do in 1943 with the forces and equipment they had available? A cross-channel invasion on the scale required to breach German defences in France was, the planners agreed, beyond Allied capacity in that year. The landing craft did not yet exist in sufficient numbers. The trained divisions were not yet ready. The logistical infrastructure had not been built. To attempt the invasion prematurely would be to risk catastrophe on a scale that could set the Allied cause back by years. With that reality accepted, however reluctantly by the Americans, the question shifted: if not France in 1943, then where? The answer that emerged from the conference rooms and map tables of Casablanca was Sicily. The island lay at the waist of the Mediterranean, roughly 250 kilometers from the North African coast at its nearest point. It would reopen the full length of the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, saving enormous quantities of fuel and time that had been lost by routing convoys around the Cape of Good Hope. It would remove a significant base from which Axis air power had been harassing Allied supply lines, and it would strike directly at Italy itself, not just at Italian territory, but at Italian willingness to continue a war that had already cost the country dearly in men, materiel, and prestige. The strategic logic was, for all the disagreements about broader priorities, genuinely compelling. Sicily was a target that made sense on multiple levels simultaneously, and that convergence of advantages was difficult to argue against. There was also the matter of what a Sicilian campaign might do to the Italian government and the Italian people. By early 1943, Italy's war was going badly in almost every direction. The North African campaigns had consumed Italian divisions at a devastating rate. The Italian economy was under severe strain. Civilian morale, never high after years of sacrifice for a war that seemed to benefit Germany far more than Italy, was deteriorating. Churchill and Roosevelt understood that Italy was, in some sense, the weaker link in the Axis partnership, a partner who had entered the alliance out of opportunism rather than ideological solidarity of the kind that bound Germany's leadership to its course. A blow to Sicily might not simply damage Italy's military capacity. It might shatter Italy's political will to continue fighting altogether and remove an entire Axis nation from the war at a single stroke. That possibility was enormously attractive to Allied planners who were carefully counting the cost of every operation. The decision was made. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, was formally agreed upon at Casablanca, and with that agreement came the full weight of what it would require. No Allied force had yet attempted to land in strength on Axis-held European territory. The landings in North Africa the previous November had been against French colonial forces whose resistance, though real in places, was nothing like what German and Italian defenders on European soil would provide. Sicily would be different. The island was home to substantial Axis garrison forces. Its coastline was fortified. Its terrain, mountainous, broken, and difficult, favored defenders. And across the narrow strait at the island's northeastern tip, the Italian mainland waited, with all the reinforcements and complications it implied. Eisenhower, appointed as the supreme Allied commander for the operation, understood from the beginning that Husky would be unlike anything the Allies had yet attempted. The scale of coordination required was staggering. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces would need to plan together, train together, and fight together across a landing front that stretched for more than 150 kilometers of coastline. Naval forces would have to transport, protect, and supply that entire operation while simultaneously defending against air and submarine attack. Air forces would need to suppress Axis air power, provide close support to ground forces, and interdict enemy supply lines, all at once, across a theatre of war where the Allies were still building their air strength. The planning challenges were not merely difficult, they were, by any previous standard of military organization, barely imaginable. And yet there was something else present at Casablanca besides the weight of those challenges, something that is easy to overlook if one focuses only on the strategic arguments and the logistical calculations. There was, among the senior Allied commanders and the political leaders who directed them, a growing sense that the tide of the war had genuinely turned. The victories in North Africa, culminating in the surrender of more than 200,000 Axis troops in Tunisia just months after Casablanca, would confirm what many already suspected, that the Axis powers, for all their tactical skill and ferocious resilience, were losing the strategic initiative. The war was moving in one direction now. The question was how quickly it could be pressed, and at what cost. Roosevelt and Churchill left Casablanca, having also issued something that would resonate far beyond the military decisions of those conference rooms. A joint declaration that the Allies would accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of all Axis powers. The statement was deliberate and carefully worded. It was intended to signal to Germany, Italy, and Japan that there would be no negotiated peace, no compromise settlement, no repeat of the ambiguous armistice that had ended the First World War and left so much unresolved. It was also intended to reassure the Soviet Union, fighting desperately on the Eastern Front, that its Western allies were committed to total victory and would not make a separate peace that left Moscow isolated. The declaration shaped everything that followed, including the Sicilian campaign, because it defined what Allied victory had to mean. The men and women who would fight and die in Sicily over the summer of 1943 knew almost none of this when it was decided. They knew the training schedules they were given, the equipment they were issued, the officers they served under, the grand strategic logic that had placed Sicily in the crosshairs of Allied planning existed in a world far above the level at which soldiers lived and died. But that logic was real, and its consequences were already in motion. Across the ports of North Africa, ships were beginning to assemble. In training camps from Egypt to Morocco, soldiers were rehearsing landings on beaches chosen for their resemblance to a coastline most of them had never seen. In the map rooms of Algiers and London and Washington, the planning staffs were beginning the enormous, grinding work of translating a political decision into a military operation. The invasion of Sicily was coming. What it would cost, and what it would ultimately achieve, remained to be discovered. The decision had been made. Sicily would be the target. But sitting in a conference room with a map and agreeing on a destination is one thing. Actually getting there, coordinating hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of ships, dozens of competing egos, and an enemy who would be waiting, is something else entirely. In the weeks that followed the Casablanca conference, the weight of that decision settled on the shoulders of General Dwight Eisenhower and his planning staff, with a force that no communiqué from the combined chiefs of staff could adequately prepare them for. What they were being asked to do had never been done before, not at this scale, not with this complexity, and not with this much riding on the outcome. The planning process for what would become Operation Husky was, from its very first days, a study in controlled frustration. Eisenhower was not a man who had led troops in the field through years of hard campaigning. He was a planner, a coordinator, a political navigator in uniform, qualities that had earned him the supreme command in the Mediterranean, and qualities that would now be tested to their limit. His headquarters in Algiers became the nerve center of an effort that stretched across 2 continents and 3 allied nations. The Americans, the British, and the Canadians each brought their own doctrines, their own command cultures, and their own strong opinions about how an invasion of this kind should be conducted. Eisenhower's central task, before he could even begin to address enemy defenses, was to forge these 3 distinct military traditions into something that could function as a single fighting force. That task was harder than it sounds, and the early weeks of planning made that very clear. The first serious disagreement emerged almost immediately, and it centered on a question that sounds deceptively simple. Where exactly on Sicily should the Allies land? Sicily is a roughly triangular island, its coastline offering dozens of possible landing sites, each with its own combination of beaches, terrain, ports, and access roads leading inland. Some planners argued for dispersed landings across multiple points to stretch the island's defenders thin and capture key ports quickly. Others believed concentration was essential, that spreading forces too widely in the opening hours of an amphibious assault invited defeat in detail, with individual landing groups overwhelmed before reinforcements could reach them. These were not minor tactical quibbles. Each proposed landing configuration implied a completely different operational plan, a different allocation of shipping, a different sequence of objectives. The disagreements consumed weeks of staff work and produced a succession of draft plans, each of which was revised, rejected, or substantially altered before the next iteration arrived. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British Eighth Army and never a man inclined toward diplomatic restraint, was among the loudest voices in these debates. Montgomery had a gift for clarity of thought and an equally pronounced gift for antagonizing the people around him. He reviewed early planning proposals and found them, in his estimation, dangerously fragmented. He argued forcefully for concentrated landings in the southeastern corner of the island, keeping American and British forces close enough together to support one another and massing combat power where it could do the most immediate good. His critics, and there were many, pointed out that concentration also meant predictability, that landing exactly where the terrain funneled forces naturally might not be the surprise the operation required. The arguments went back and forth, through meetings and memoranda and heated exchanges that occasionally left staff officers on both sides of the Atlantic exhausted and exasperated. While the commanders argued over objectives, the logistics officers were quietly confronting a set of problems that threatened to render the entire debate academic. An amphibious assault of this scale required landing craft, enormous quantities of them, and in the spring of 1943, landing craft were among the most contested resources in the Allied war effort. Every theatre of operations wanted them. The Pacific demanded them. The planners already dreaming of a cross-channel invasion into France demanded them. The Mediterranean theatre had to compete for its allocation, and what arrived was never quite enough. The particular vessel that defined so much of the planning calculus was the landing ship tank, a flat-bottomed ocean-going vessel capable of driving directly onto a beach and disgorging vehicles, armor, and heavy equipment directly onto the sand. Without sufficient numbers of these ships, the assault waves could carry infantry ashore, but could not bring the tanks and heavy guns that would be needed to hold ground against armored counterattack. The numbers were calculated and recalculated, requests were submitted and partially filled, and the planners learned to build their operational designs around the uncomfortable reality of what they had, rather than what they wished for. Coordinating the movement of forces to their staging areas was itself an exercise of staggering complexity. Montgomery's Eighth Army was spread across Egypt and Libya, training and reorganizing after the long campaign in North Africa. Patton's Seventh Army, then still designated as I Armored Corps before its elevation to full army status, was gathering in Morocco and Tunisia, its component units drawn from across the American military establishment. Canadian forces were assembling in Britain, requiring a separate transatlantic movement before they could even join the staging process in the Mediterranean. Each of these forces needed to arrive at its embarkation point at a specific time, loaded in a specific sequence, so that the men and equipment that needed to land first were positioned on the right ships in the right ports. Getting that loading sequence wrong was not merely inconvenient. It could mean infantry arriving without their support weapons, or tanks landing without fuel, or an entire formation arriving at the wrong beach entirely. Intelligence presented its own challenges. The planning staff knew the broad outlines of Sicily's geography from maps and pre-war records. But the details that mattered most for an amphibious assault, the gradient of beaches, the trafficability of the sand, the position of obstacles and coastal guns, the exact locations of enemy defensive positions inland, required fresh information gathered under difficult and dangerous conditions. Aerial reconnaissance aircraft flew repeated sorties over the island, bringing back photographs that intelligence analysts studied with magnifying lenses, identifying gun emplacements, troop concentrations, and potential landing obstacles. Submarine crews conducted clandestine surveys of selected beaches, their reports filtering back to planning staffs where every detail was weighed against the operational requirements. The picture that emerged was incomplete and sometimes contradictory, as intelligence pictures always are, and the planners had to make decisions knowing that the gaps in their knowledge might only be filled by the enemy's response on the morning of the assault. German and Italian defensive dispositions added another layer of uncertainty. The island was garrisoned primarily by Italian forces, but German commanders had positioned elite armored units in strategic reserve, ready to respond to a landing before Allied forces could consolidate a beachhead. The precise locations of these reserves, and the speed at which they could move, were subjects of ongoing intelligence analysis and considerable anxiety among Allied planners. An armored counterattack reaching the beaches within the first few hours of the landing, before sufficient anti-tank weapons and reinforcements were ashore, could be catastrophic. Every plan that moved through the planning process had to account for this threat, building in enough combat power in the initial assault waves to absorb the blow that German armor would inevitably deliver. The question of timing added yet another variable to an already complicated equation. The assault had to take place in darkness to preserve surprise, which meant the fleet had to navigate to its positions in the hours before dawn and land the first waves while night still provided some cover from coastal artillery. But darkness also complicated navigation, and the distances involved, from North African ports to Sicilian beaches, meant that the fleet would be at sea during daylight hours on its approach, potentially visible to enemy reconnaissance aircraft. The moon phase mattered too, providing enough light for navigation without illuminating the assault boats for enemy gunners. Meteorological staff studied prevailing weather patterns and tidal cycles, producing recommendations that were then weighed against all the other constraints. The window of acceptable conditions was narrow, and choosing the wrong date could mean launching into rough seas, scattered formations, and soaked equipment. There were moments during those weeks of grinding staff work when the entire enterprise seemed to teeter on the edge of impossibility. Revised plans accumulated in staff officers' folders, arguments that had seemed settled reopened. Eisenhower managed competing egos and irreconcilable national priorities with a patience that became, itself, a kind of strategy. He understood that the plan that eventually emerged would be imperfect, that all plans are imperfect, and that what mattered in the end was not perfection on paper, but the capacity of the men and commanders executing it to adapt when reality inevitably diverged from intention. That understanding shaped his approach to every decision, from the broadest questions of strategy down to the specific allocation of landing craft. By late spring of 1943, a workable plan had finally taken shape. It was a compromise, as all coalition plans must be, bearing the marks of every argument and concession that had shaped it. The concentrated southeastern landing approach that Montgomery had pressed for survived, though modified by American requirements and the demands of naval scheduling. The force assignments, the loading plans, the fire support arrangements, and the air cover schedules were locked in, circulated to the commanders who would execute them, and memorized by the staff officers who would manage the 1,000 details that turn plans into operations. Across the Mediterranean, in port cities and training camps, soldiers were beginning to sense that something large was approaching. They did not yet know where they were going, but somewhere in an Algiers headquarters, the map on the wall showed a triangular island, and the lines drawn across it pointed toward every beach on its southern shore. Across the breadth of North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean, something vast and purposeful was taking shape. Through the late winter and into the spring of 1943, men and machines began flowing toward collection points, staging areas, and harbors that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Morocco all the way to the Nile Delta. It was a movement of extraordinary scale, governed by lists and manifests and sailing schedules that filled entire rooms of filing cabinets. Yet to the ordinary soldier, the private from Georgia sweating through a morning run on the Tunisian coast, or the corporal from Yorkshire cleaning his rifle in the shroud of a North African palm, none of it made immediate sense. Orders came, and then more orders. New equipment arrived. Strange, unfamiliar craft appeared in the harbors. Something was being built, carefully and deliberately, though its true purpose remained a closely guarded secret, known only to a handful of men in rooms with locked doors. General Bernard Montgomery commanded the British Eighth Army, a force that had earned its reputation the hard way, through the grinding desert battles of North Africa, through the reversal at Tobruk, and then the long, redemptive drive westward from El Alamein. His men knew hardship in a very particular way, the kind that leaves a mark not easily erased by rest or reassignment. Through the early months of 1943, the Eighth Army was drawing itself together in Egypt and along the Libyan coastline, absorbing replacements, integrating fresh equipment, and undergoing the methodical reorganization that Montgomery believed was the essential precondition for any offensive action. He was a man who trusted preparation above all else, and he imposed that belief on every level of his command. Units were brought up to strength, supply chains were audited and reinforced, officers were evaluated, and, when found wanting, replaced without sentiment. The Eighth Army was being sharpened, carefully and deliberately, into something precise. Alongside the Eighth Army, Canadian formations were preparing for the most consequential operation in their nation's short wartime experience. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade were new to this theatre, having crossed the Atlantic in relatively recent months, and their soldiers carried with them the particular alertness of men who had trained long and hard but not yet faced the full weight of combat. They were integrated into Montgomery's command with care, assigned their role in the broader landing plan, and set to work on the same drills and rehearsals as their British counterparts. For Canada as a nation, this mattered deeply. There was a hunger in those formations to prove themselves, to justify the sacrifice and the distance and the waiting. Their officers knew it, and Montgomery's staff was careful not to waste that energy. Far to the west, General George Patton was assembling a very different kind of army. The 7th Army, in these spring weeks still taking its final shape, was pulling together American divisions from Morocco and Tunisia, drawing men from units that had fought their early battles with varying degrees of success and failure. Patton did not dwell on failure, but he refused to ignore it either. The lessons of Kasserine Pass, where American troops had been roughly handled by German armor earlier in the year, were absorbed and processed into a new urgency. Patton drove his officers mercilessly, demanding standards of discipline, fitness, and tactical awareness that some found brutal and others found exhilarating. He understood that what had gone wrong in Tunisia was not primarily a failure of courage. It was a failure of preparation, of unit cohesion, and of command confidence. He was determined that those failures would not travel forward into the next operation. The logistical challenge facing the planners of Operation Husky was unlike anything the Allies had yet attempted. Moving more than 160,000 men across open water required not simply ships, but the right ships, in the right numbers, at the right time, an equation that proved fiendishly difficult to balance. Landing craft were in perpetual short supply, contested between the demands of the Pacific theater, the Atlantic, and the emerging requirements of the Mediterranean. The vessels that did become available were gathered with enormous effort from ports across North Africa: Oran, Bizerte, Tunis, Alexandria, Port Said. Dock workers and naval logistics officers worked through the nights cataloguing cargo, calculating weights and loading sequences, trying to ensure that when the first waves hit the beaches, the men would have ammunition, food, medical supplies, and the means to fight. Training was the other great undertaking of those spring months, and it proceeded with an intensity that reflected how much was at stake. Commanders at every level understood that an amphibious assault is among the most technically demanding of all military operations. The margin for error is thin, the opportunity for catastrophic confusion is ever present, and the consequences of failure are not abstract. Beaches were selected along the North African coast whose geography, gradient, and surf conditions loosely mirrored what aerial reconnaissance photographs suggested about Sicily's southern shore. Units practiced loading into landing craft in harbour, crossing short stretches of water, and storming ashore in coordinated waves. They did it again and again. They did it in daylight and in darkness. They practiced it when everything went smoothly, and they practiced it when it went badly, when craft broached on the sand, when men tangled in the surf, when the sequence of waves collapsed into disorder. The soldiers training on those North African beaches had no confirmed knowledge of where they were going. Security around Operation Husky was intense and carefully maintained. Rumors circulated freely, as they always do among soldiers with time and imagination, and the rumors ranged from a landing in Greece to an assault on the south of France to a return to continental Europe's western edge. Some of the men believed they were preparing for an operation against Sardinia. Others suspected the Balkans. Officers who did know the truth were forbidden from discussing it, and the cover stories that Allied intelligence had carefully constructed, stories pointing away from Sicily toward entirely different objectives, had filtered down in fragmented form into the conversational ecosystem of the camps. The men trained hard without knowing precisely why, which is both a tribute to military discipline and a remarkable example of how institutions can direct human energy without fully explaining its purpose. Naval forces were assembling with equal urgency. The operation required not merely transport vessels but warships in substantial numbers, cruisers and destroyers to provide fire support, submarines to conduct patrols, minesweepers to clear approaches, and escort vessels to protect the convoys from the very real threat of German and Italian submarines and aircraft. The Royal Navy and the United States Navy coordinated this effort across multiple commands, working through chains of responsibility that were still being defined and refined in those early months of genuine Allied cooperation. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, the senior naval commander for the operation, brought to the role a lifetime of Mediterranean experience and a clear understanding of what the sea could and could not offer in terms of protection and opportunity. His staff worked the problem from every angle, trying to anticipate each point at which naval coordination might fail. Air power was the third great element gathering through those spring weeks. Allied air forces in the Mediterranean had been fighting hard through the Tunisian campaign, and their aircraft, dispersed across dozens of airfields from Morocco to Egypt, were now being reoriented toward the tasks that Operation Husky would demand. Bombers were assigned targets on the Sicilian mainland, airfields, rail yards, port facilities, and coastal gun emplacements. Fighter squadrons rehearsed the complex business of providing air cover over a beachhead, a task that required precise coordination with ground and naval forces and left very little margin for the kind of miscommunication that could turn friendly aircraft into targets. The lessons from earlier operations, where the relationship between air and ground had sometimes been strained, were incorporated into planning documents and drilled into pilots and controllers alike. Meanwhile, at the highest levels of command, disagreements about the operation's shape had not entirely resolved themselves. Montgomery and Patton were men of large temperament and competing vision, and the friction between British and American perspectives on how the invasion should proceed had been visible from the earliest planning sessions. Montgomery had pressed for a concentrated landing pattern that kept his forces close enough to one another to provide mutual support. Patton's planners favored a broader front that could exploit surprise across multiple landing zones simultaneously. Eisenhower, as supreme commander, navigated these competing arguments with a combination of patience and firm authority, working to preserve the personal relationships that the coalition's success depended upon, while ensuring that the final plan was militarily coherent. The plan that emerged reflected compromise, as all real plans do. Supply dumps grew through March and April and into May, accumulating ammunition and fuel and rations and spare parts across the staging areas, in quantities that strained the capacity of every port facility the Allies controlled in the theatre. Engineers repaired and expanded dock facilities. Road networks were surveyed and strengthened to handle the weight of vehicles that would flow through them in the final days before embarkation. Medical units established field hospitals and rehearsed triage procedures. Chaplains met with their men. Officers wrote letters they did not send. The machinery of a modern army preparing for the largest amphibious invasion yet attempted was turning over with gathering momentum, filling the Mediterranean spring with the sounds of engines and orders and the quiet, persistent labor of men who understood, in some wordless way, that history was being made around them, whether they could name it or not. By the time the Tunisian campaign drew to its close in May, delivering more than 200,000 Axis prisoners into Allied hands and clearing North Africa of organized resistance, the assembly of forces for Operation Husky had reached the point where its own momentum was becoming difficult to reverse. The men on the beaches, American, British, Canadian, were as ready as training could make them. The ships were loaded or nearly so. The plans were drawn and redrawn and distributed to commanders at every level. And Sicily, across the narrow sea, waited in ignorance of what was coming, its coastal defenders watching the empty horizon while, just beyond their sight, 160,000 men prepared to cross it. By the spring of 1943, Sicily was an island bracing for a blow it could feel coming but could not see clearly. The sound of war had been growing louder for months, carried on radio broadcasts, whispered through coastal towns, written into the faces of soldiers who had come home from North Africa broken and diminished. The Italian Sixth Army held the island's defense on paper, and its commander, General Alfredo Guzzoni, was a careful, experienced officer who understood exactly what he was working with. What he had at his disposal was, in many respects, a force hollowed out by 3 years of war, political dysfunction, and the slow erosion of a nation's belief in the conflict it had been asked to fight. Guzzoni knew that the 200,000 men spread across Sicily's coastlines and interior represented something more complicated than a defensive army. They represented a country exhausted to its roots, still in uniform, still manning their posts, but leaning against the weight of a war that had taken far more from Italy than it had ever given back. The general did not have the luxury of illusions. He had the island, the men, and the problem of making them hold. The numbers, at first glance, suggested strength. 200,000 troops is not a small force, and Sicily is not a large island. Positioned at coastal strongpoints, dug into the volcanic hills, spread across the broad agricultural plain of the south, those men could theoretically contest every beach, every road, every ridge. But numbers, as every commander learns eventually, are only part of the equation. The Italian divisions on Sicily were, in the majority, coastal units, formations that bore little resemblance to the battle-hardened divisions that had fought in the western desert. Many of their soldiers had been conscripted from the Italian south itself, men who looked out at the same sea the Allied fleet would one day cross, and who did not always see the enemy their government told them to find there. Their equipment was outdated, their artillery obsolete in comparison to what was ranged against them, and their supply lines were thin threads running across the Mediterranean under Allied air and naval pressure. A soldier who has not eaten well, who carries a rifle that may or may not function reliably, and who has watched his country's fortunes collapse over 3 years of distant campaigning, is not the same soldier as one who believes, fully, in what he is defending. The campaigns in North Africa had consumed Italian manpower and prestige in roughly equal measure. Division after division had been sent east to fight alongside German forces under conditions that were, for the Italian soldier, often near impossible. Undersupplied, under-equipped, and frequently subordinated to German commanders who made no great effort to conceal their contempt. The men who came back spoke of things that did not encourage their comrades still waiting in Sicily, and those who had not gone knew the outcome well enough. The surrender at Tunis in May of 1943, in which more than 200,000 Axis soldiers had passed into Allied captivity, had sent a signal that travelled faster than any military dispatch. If North Africa, with all its strategic importance, could not be held, what exactly was Sicily supposed to represent in the larger scheme of things? Guzzoni could impose discipline. He could not manufacture conviction. The physical terrain of Sicily offered both opportunity and complication to a defender. The island's southern and southeastern coastlines, where the Allied planners were already beginning to focus their attention, were relatively flat and open, beaches backed by modest dunes and agricultural land that gave an attacker room to move once he was ashore. Further inland, the terrain changed character entirely. The mountains of the interior, the volcanic ridges, the narrow valleys cut by fast rivers, these were a defender's natural allies, places where small, determined forces could make an attacker pay in blood for every kilometer gained. Guzzoni understood this geography and built his defensive thinking around it. He positioned the majority of his coastal units along the shoreline, accepting that they would take the first blow, and held his mobile reserves further back, hoping to use the interior terrain to slow any Allied advance while counterattacks were organized. It was a reasonable plan on a map. Its weakness was that it depended on men who had to believe it was worth executing. Then there was the German factor, and it changed everything. Not in a way that simplified Guzzoni's situation, but in a way that added an entirely different layer of complexity to it. Berlin and Rome agreed, after considerable friction, that German forces would be deployed to Sicily to stiffen the defense and provide the kind of armored striking power that Italian formations could not. The officer overseeing the positioning of German armored strength on the island was General Hasso von Manteuffel, a man who embodied the aggressive, technically precise tradition of German panzer command. Von Manteuffel was not there to share authority graciously. He was there because the Germans did not trust the Italians to hold, and he carried that assessment in every operational decision he made. The relationship between the German and Italian commands on Sicily was one of the alliance's most uncomfortable fictions, formally cooperative, practically divided at almost every significant juncture. The German forces committed to Sicily's defense were not symbolic tokens. They included elite panzer formations equipped with armored vehicles that outclassed most of what the Allies could put ashore in the early hours of any landing. Von Manteuffel's instinct was to position these formations not on the beaches, where they would be exposed to naval gunfire and air attack during the vulnerable hours of an Allied assault, but inland, held back as a concentrated mobile reserve. The logic was clear. Let the coastal defenders absorb the initial shock, then drive the armored fist into the beachhead before the Allies could consolidate, before their supplies were ashore, before their foothold became a foundation. The window for such a counterstrike was narrow, hours, not days, but if executed with sufficient speed and weight, it could push an invading force back into the sea before it found its feet. This was the scenario Allied planners feared most, and it was precisely the scenario von Manteuffel was designing for. The positioning of German panzer units across the island became a source of quiet, persistent tension between the two Allied commands. Guzzoni had his own views about where reserves should be held and how they should be employed, and he was, formally speaking, in command of the island's overall defense. Von Manteuffel operated within that structure while maintaining, through the mechanisms of German military authority, a degree of operational independence that gave Rome genuine concern. The Italians worried, not without reason, that in a crisis, German commanders would act according to German priorities, which might or might not align with the broader requirements of Sicily's defense. History would give these concerns a certain vindication, but in the spring of 1943, the two sides maintained the appearance of coordination and prepared, each in its own way, for an attack they knew was coming. Along the southern coast, the coastal divisions settled into their positions with the resigned professionalism of soldiers who have been told to hold a line they know is thin. Pillboxes were built and improved. Minefields were laid in the surf zones and along likely landing beaches. Artillery batteries were positioned to cover the approaches, though their range and caliber varied enormously, and the supply of ammunition was a constant anxiety. Small naval craft patrolled the coastal waters, insufficient in number and capability to challenge a major Allied fleet, but enough to provide some early warning. Observation posts on the higher ground scanned the Mediterranean horizon during every watch, day and night, knowing that what they were looking for could appear at any time. The waiting, as any soldier will confirm, is its own particular form of suffering. Inland, in the towns and villages of Sicily's agricultural heartland, the civilian population watched all of this with feelings that did not map neatly onto the categories of loyalty and resistance. Sicily had its own complex relationship with the Italian state, an island that had historically been governed more than it had governed itself, that had sent its sons to a war declared by a regime in Rome, and that now found itself the front line of a conflict between great powers who had, in different ways, decided its geography made it important. Sicilian farmers watched German tanks roll through their olive groves and did not universally see liberators in the grey vehicles. They watched Italian soldiers man their coastal guns and did not universally see heroes. They waited, as the soldiers waited, for something to resolve the terrible uncertainty of their situation. For Guzzoni, the weeks before the invasion were a sustained exercise in managing inadequacy with professional dignity. He communicated his concerns upward through the Italian command structure, about ammunition shortages, about the quality of coastal units, about the need for more German armor if the island was to be seriously defended. Some of his requests were addressed, many were not. Rome had its own political pressures, its own awareness of the fragility of public support for a war that had gone catastrophically wrong in North Africa, and its own complicated relationship with a German ally that was simultaneously indispensable and deeply resented. Guzzoni did what commanders in his position have always done. He worked with what he had, positioned his forces as intelligently as the terrain and his resources allowed, and waited for the moment when all the preparation would be tested against reality. By early July of 1943, the island held its breath. Along more than 150 kilometers of southern coastline, soldiers in concrete positions watched the sea. In the hills behind them, German panzer crews sat in their vehicles or slept beside them, engines ready to be started at the sound of an alert. In command posts from Palermo to Syracuse, officers bent over maps and updated their intelligence assessments of Allied fleet movements, of activity in North African ports, of patterns in the aerial reconnaissance they knew was sweeping the island from end to end. Everyone understood that the question was no longer whether the Allies were coming. The question was where and when, and whether the defense, fragile in ways that official reports did not fully capture, would hold long enough to matter. War is won in the mind before it is won on the ground, before a single soldier wades ashore, before the first landing craft scrapes against sand. The contest of deception and knowledge has already begun. An invisible war fought with forged papers, intercepted signals, and the patient work of analysts sitting far from any battlefield. In the spring of 1943, that invisible war was reaching its most audacious phase. Allied intelligence services understood something fundamental. A force of more than 160,000 men crossing open water toward a heavily defended island cannot rely on courage alone. It needs the enemy looking the wrong way. The idea that would become Operation Mincemeat was, at its core, brutally simple. Plant false information on a corpse. Make it look like the body of a British staff officer who had drowned at sea carrying secret documents, and allow the currents of the Atlantic to deliver that corpse to Axis-controlled territory. The documents would name Greece and Sardinia as the true Allied invasion targets, steering Hitler's attention away from Sicily entirely. What the idea lacked in elegance, it more than made up for in nerve. British intelligence officers who championed the plan understood they were not merely asking the enemy to believe a lie, they were asking them to believe a dead man's secrets. The body chosen was that of a Welshman who had died in London of pneumonia, his lungs carrying fluid consistent enough with drowning to survive a cursory medical examination. He was given a constructed identity, a Royal Marines officer with a name, a rank, personal letters, theatre ticket stubs, and a photograph of a woman described as his fiancée. Small, human details designed to make him real rather than convenient. Around his wrist, attached by a chain, was a briefcase. Inside that briefcase were letters between senior Allied officers, carefully written to suggest that Sicily was a deliberate feint, while Greece and Sardinia were the genuine objectives. Every word had been chosen with the knowledge that Axis intelligence analysts would study every syllable. In late April of 1943, a British submarine surfaced in the Atlantic off the Spanish coast and, in darkness, released the body into the sea. Spain was officially neutral, but its intelligence services were known to share information with Germany, and that was precisely the point. The currents did their work. The body washed ashore, was recovered by Spanish authorities, and the documents passed, as hoped, Through channels that led directly to German intelligence desks, Berlin received the material, studied it, and drew exactly the conclusions Allied planners had intended. Axis forces were reinforced in Greece. German armor that might otherwise have strengthened Sicily's defenses was held in reserve elsewhere. The deception had worked, though nobody in London could be certain of that yet. What Operation Mincemeat achieved was extraordinary precisely because it did not stand alone. It was one layer in a far deeper architecture of deliberate misdirection. Allied deception planners understood that a single planted document, however convincing, could be dismissed as a trick, but a document that seemed to confirm what other intelligence, real or fabricated, was already suggesting, that was far harder to dismiss. Throughout the months preceding the invasion, Allied operations across the Mediterranean reinforced the impression that Greece and Sardinia were primary targets. Increased aerial reconnaissance over those areas, diversionary radio traffic, hints dropped through double agents already embedded in Axis intelligence networks. The enemy was not shown a single lie. He was shown a world in which the lie made perfect sense. Yet deception was only one side of the intelligence effort. While British officers were busy constructing elaborate fictions for Axis consumption, American and British analysts were working in the opposite direction, stripping away every fiction the enemy possessed and replacing it with truth. The most valuable tool in this effort was signals intelligence, the art of intercepting and decoding enemy communications. Allied codebreakers had, over years of painstaking work, achieved the ability to read significant portions of Axis military signal traffic. This meant that German and Italian orders, supply requests, defensive assessments, and troop dispositions were often known to Allied commanders before they were acted upon. The intelligence picture, being assembled in planning rooms across North Africa, was not guesswork. It was built on enemy words. Aerial reconnaissance brought a different kind of knowledge. High-altitude aircraft flew repeated missions over Sicily in the weeks and months before the invasion, photographing coastal batteries, beach gradients, road networks, and the positions of airfields. Photo interpreters, specialists who could read the shadow and texture of aerial photographs with extraordinary precision, worked through the images methodically, building up a detailed picture of what the Allies would face. They identified the emplacements of artillery pieces. They counted landing obstacles on the beaches. They noted where defenses were strongest and where gaps existed in the coverage. This was intelligence as architecture, the slow, careful construction of a picture of a defended island that could be used to choose landing zones and plan routes of advance. The picture that emerged from this combined effort was sobering in some respects and encouraging in others. Italian defensive positions were extensive but frequently obsolescent. Concrete emplacements holding guns that had not been modernized, manned by units whose supply lines were stretched and whose morale, by intercepted accounts, was not strong. The Italian Sixth Army occupying Sicily was large on paper, but the intercepted communications of its own officers painted a force that was under-equipped, under-motivated, and deeply uncertain about its prospects. German units were a different matter entirely. The Wehrmacht formations assigned to the island were fewer in number, but substantially more capable, and Allied analysts worked hard to track their exact positions and anticipated response times so that landing zones could be selected to minimize early contact with German armor. One of the critical questions the intelligence effort had to answer was the vulnerability of Sicily's airfields. Control of the air over the invasion beaches would determine whether the Allies could sustain their landings against counterattack, and the airfields of Sicily and the surrounding islands were the platforms from which Axis air power would operate. Aerial reconnaissance identified the locations of those fields, the presence or absence of aircraft, and the patterns of Axis air operations. This information fed directly into the decision to conduct an intense preliminary air campaign before the invasion, hammering Axis airfields in the weeks preceding the landings to reduce the threat to the fleet and the assault waves. The bombing of those fields was not random. It was the product of an intelligence map built photograph by photograph, signal by signal. There was also intelligence of a more human kind, the knowledge that came from Sicilian and Italian sources, from individuals who made contact with Allied representatives, from the network of relationships that Allied intelligence had cultivated across the Mediterranean world. Sicily's population had its own reasons to distrust the war their government had brought to their island. Information about local conditions, roads, water sources, and the dispositions of garrison forces filtered through channels that were difficult to verify but too valuable to ignore. Planners treated this human intelligence carefully, cross-referencing it against aerial photographs and signals data, using it to fill gaps that technology could not reach. By the first weeks of July 1943, the intelligence architecture supporting Operation Husky was as complete as it would ever be. Commanders knew where the beaches were weakest and where the defenses were heaviest. They knew the approximate locations of German armored reserves and had estimates, carefully qualified but credible, of how quickly those reserves could reach the landing zones once the invasion began. They knew, from decrypted signals, that Axis commanders remained genuinely uncertain about where the blow would fall, their attention divided between multiple possible targets. And they knew that the dead man drifting ashore in Spain had done his work, that the documents in his briefcase had been read and believed. Every piece of this knowledge had been bought through patient, unglamorous labor, through analysts working in airless rooms, through pilots flying alone over a defended island, through intelligence officers gambling enormous resources on the human capacity to believe a convincing lie. That knowledge would not guarantee success. No amount of intelligence, however precise, eliminates the chaos of battle or the resilience of a determined enemy. But it shaped the conditions in which success became possible. It meant that when the assault waves crossed the darkened water towards Sicily's shores, they were not crossing into the unknown. They were crossing into a space that Allied minds had already, in some sense, mapped and measured. The men who would fight and die on those beaches did not know the names of the analysts and intelligence officers who had worked to protect them. They never would. But the work had been done, the picture had been drawn, and the greatest deception in the Mediterranean War had placed an entire army in exactly the wrong place at exactly the right time. The 9th of July, 1943. Across the harbours and anchorages of North Africa, something enormous and irreversible was already in motion. From Oran and Algiers in the west, from Tunis and Sfax and Sousse, from the bustling roads behind Tripoli, from Alexandria and Port Said in the east, the machinery of invasion had been coiling for months, and now it began to unfurl. Convoys of trucks ground through pre-dawn darkness, delivering the last crates of ammunition, the final pallets of medical supplies, the tens of thousands of soldiers who had spent weeks training on beaches, chosen to mirror what awaited them across the water. The men did not yet know, most of them, exactly where they were going. They had been told enough to understand that it was serious. They had been told enough to be afraid. The fleet that gathered off the North African coast in those final hours before sailing was unlike anything the Mediterranean had ever held. More than 160,000 fighting men had been loaded, unit by unit, into transport ships and landing craft, their weapons and vehicles lashed into cargo holds, or tied down on open decks. Tanks sat in the bellies of converted freighters. Trucks and artillery pieces were craned into hulls that had carried grain and oil the year before. Thousands of tons of fuel, rations, ammunition, and medical stores had been packed with painstaking care into vessels that ranged from purpose-built landing ships to requisitioned ferries. The logistics alone, the coordination of cargo, manifests, loading sequences, and sailing schedules across dozens of separate ports in 2 different countries, represented a feat of administrative will that the Allied planners had spent the better part of 6 months trying to solve. Now, in the gathering heat of a North African morning, the solution was floating. Radio silence had been imposed across the entire fleet. No ship would transmit a signal that German or Italian listening posts might intercept. No officer would break the quiet of the airwaves to confirm a position or request instructions. The silence was total, deliberate, and slightly unnerving to the men aboard, who had grown accustomed to the constant crackle of wireless traffic as a sign that the world was still functioning around them. Now, without that sound, the war felt both closer and more abstract. Ships moved according to sealed orders and prearranged routes, each captain trusting the plan drawn up weeks earlier by staff officers in rooms the sailors had never seen. The Mediterranean, for the moment, kept its secrets. Below decks, the conditions were brutal in the way that only a troop ship fully loaded in summer heat can be. Men lay in hammocks and bunks, stacked 3 and 4 high, the air thick with the smell of bodies, diesel, and whatever the galley had managed to produce for the morning meal. Some soldiers slept, many could not. They played cards, wrote letters they knew might be the last their families would receive, or simply stared at the steel ceilings above them and rehearsed, in their minds, the briefings they had been given about the beaches they were meant to cross. Officers moved among them, checking equipment, answering questions they could not fully answer, maintaining the outward composure that their rank demanded of them. The ship's engines hummed below everything, a constant low vibration that was either reassuring or ominous, depending on the mood of the man lying still enough to feel it. The weather, as the fleet formed up and began its runs northward, was already a source of anxiety. Meteorologists attached to Allied headquarters had been tracking a low-pressure system moving across the western Mediterranean for several days. Their assessments were cautiously optimistic. The worst of the weather would likely pass before the fleet reached the assault area, and the seas were expected to moderate through the night. But the predictions carried the hedged language of men working with imperfect instruments, and everyone who read them understood what the margins meant. A sea state that was perfectly manageable for a destroyer or a troop ship became something approaching catastrophic for a flat-bottomed landing craft trying to put infantry ashore. The planners had already run the calculations. They knew the tolerances. They hoped the sea would be cooperative. It was not, entirely. By the afternoon of the 9th, as the convoys cleared the Tunisian coastline and turned toward open water, the wind had freshened to a degree that made the smaller craft strain at their tows and sent spray sheeting across open decks. Soldiers who had never been to sea found themselves in the grip of a misery they had not been warned about. Seasickness swept through the troop decks of hundreds of vessels, leaving men pale, exhausted, and deeply uncertain about their ability to fight anything when they reached the far shore. Officers who had worried about morale before the landing now had a more immediate problem, keeping their men functional through a night of pitching, rolling discomfort. The ships kept moving. There was no other option. The fleet's scale, seen from the air or imagined on a map, was almost incomprehensible. More than 2,500 vessels of every type and size were moving across the Mediterranean in coordinated streams. battleships and cruisers providing distant cover, destroyers sweeping the flanks, minesweepers running ahead to clear the approaches, submarines stationed as navigational markers at key points along the route to guide the convoys onto their correct headings. The American 7th Army's elements were converging from the west. The British 8th Army's elements were coming from further east. The Canadian forces that would strike alongside the British were threading their own path through the night. Each convoy had its own assigned lane, its own timing, its own sequence of waypoints that would, if everything held together, deliver the right forces to the right beaches at the right moment before dawn. The men who had planned this, the staff officers who had argued over maps in Algiers and Cairo, who had redrawn the landing sectors half a dozen times, who had fought bitterly over which army would receive which objectives, were now largely passengers, like everyone else. The plan existed now only in the hands of the ship's captains, the convoy commodores, the naval officers responsible for keeping hundreds of vessels in the correct order across dozens of nautical miles of open water in the dark. It was one of the peculiar features of a large-scale military operation that the people most responsible for its design were also the most powerless once it had been set in motion. General Eisenhower, in those hours, could only wait. On the transport ships, as night fell and the North African coast disappeared behind them, some of the younger soldiers made their way onto deck to watch the other ships passing in the darkness. What they saw, the dim shapes of dozens of vessels moving in the same direction, the faint white lines of bow waves, the muted running lights that were all that was permitted, stayed with some of them for the rest of their lives. There was something about the sheer size of it, the sense of collective movement toward something terrible and necessary, that bypassed ordinary language. These were young men from the farms of Oklahoma and the docks of Glasgow and the fishing villages of Nova Scotia, and they were crossing a sea together toward a shore that had been in enemy hands for more than 3 years. The darkness around them was full of other men doing exactly the same thing. It was, in its own quiet way, extraordinary. The Axis command on Sicily had not been entirely unprepared for the possibility of an Allied move against the island. German and Italian reconnaissance aircraft had spotted elements of the Allied buildup, and intelligence summaries had been circulating through Axis headquarters for weeks, suggesting that an amphibious operation in the central Mediterranean was likely. What Axis planners could not agree on was exactly where. Operation Mincemeat, the British deception that had planted forged documents suggesting Greece as the true objective, had done its work with remarkable success in the weeks before. Axis forces in the Balkans had been reinforced. Sicily's defenders had been left with what they had, which in many cases was less than they needed. Now, in the darkness of the Mediterranean, the real answer was approaching at the speed of a laden convoy, roughly 10 to 12 knots, the distance closing with every hour. Somewhere in the middle hours of the night, the wind began to ease. The sea, which had been running at a height that made the smaller landing craft pitch and yaw in their tows, started to flatten into a long, heavy swell, uncomfortable but no longer dangerous. Commanders aboard the fleet's flagship vessels passed the word through their signals officers. The weather was holding within acceptable limits. The operation would proceed. The beaches were now only hours away. In the troop decks below the waterlines of 1,000 ships, men who had finally managed to sleep were beginning to be shaken awake by NCOs moving through the dim red light of battle lamps, quietly and without ceremony, giving each man the same instruction: get your kit on, eat what you can, check your weapon, it is time. The island lay ahead in the darkness, invisible but known, mapped and photographed and briefed, until every officer could have drawn its southern coastline from memory. Somewhere on those beaches, Italian coastal units were watching the sea. Somewhere further inland, German panzers sat at readiness in their assembly areas, waiting for the call that would tell them where to move. Between those defenders and the water, there was now a fleet of more than 2,500 ships, carrying the largest amphibious force ever assembled in the history of warfare to that point, moving in silence through a Mediterranean night that was finally, mercifully, beginning to calm. The 9th of July was ending, the 10th was about to begin, and across the dark water Sicily waited. The Mediterranean night hangs heavy and warm over the waters south of Sicily. Thousands of men crowd the decks and holds of transport ships, their faces shadowed in the darkness before dawn. Below deck, soldiers sit in silence, the air thick with diesel fumes and the smell of salt water. Some sleep fitfully against their rifles, others stare at nothing, thinking of letters left behind in North Africa, of homes they may never see again. The ships cut through black water in loose formation, their silhouettes barely visible against the starlit horizon. Radio silence has been absolute for hours. No one aboard knows with certainty what waits for them on the beaches ahead, though rumours have circulated through every deck and compartment. Some whisper that the defenders number in the hundreds of thousands. Others claim the Italians will surrender at first sight of the invasion fleet. The truth lies somewhere between fear and false confidence, and every man carries both into the night. The naval gunfire support ships move with steady purpose through the darkness, their gun crews at action stations, ready to respond to signals that may never come. Officers stand on bridges, scanning the water with binoculars, though there is little to see beyond their own vessels and the vast expanse of sea merging with sky. The transport ships press on toward their designated landing zones, their shallow draft hulls designed specifically for this assault. Below decks, soldiers check weapons one final time, fingers running along rifle bolts and magazines, metal on metal in the darkness. Some write final letters to mothers, wives, and sweethearts, though these letters will be collected and held until the outcome of battle is known. The ritual of preparation fills the waiting with purpose. It gives men something to do with their hands and minds as the moment approaches. No one can sleep now. Every soldier knows that within hours they will be running across open beaches toward enemy fire, and the reality of that knowledge has cleared away all pretense and false bravado. At 0300 hours, 3 in the morning, the first men begin moving topside, climbing narrow ladders from the holds onto decks crowded with equipment and other soldiers. The air above deck feels almost cool after the suffocating heat below. The outline of the Sicilian coast emerges from the darkness like a low shadow on the horizon. Officers check their watches and confer with naval liaisons. Orders are relayed in urgent whispers. The assault troops will go in first, landing craft already being lowered into the water on davits, engines rumbling to life beneath the waves. The sound carries across the water, and men on other ships hear it and know the moment has truly arrived. There is no more time for doubt or prayer or letters home. The machinery of invasion, once set in motion, cannot be stopped or reversed. The first waves of American soldiers begin descending cargo nets into the pitching assault craft, boots scrambling for purchase on the knotted rope, each man aware that a single slip means falling into the black water below. The landing craft fill quickly, 30 men per boat in some cases, packed so tightly that movement is impossible. Officers crouch in the bows, watching the shoreline grow closer with each moment. Non-commissioned officers move among their men, checking equipment one final time, speaking in low tones to steady nerves. The landing craft engines engage with a roar, and the boats pull away from the mother ships, forming into assault waves that spread across the dark water like a vast flock moving toward an unseen destination. Behind them, more waves form, dozens of landing craft loaded with additional troops, engineers, and support personnel. The sound of so many engines creates a low rumble that seems to roll across the entire stretch of sea. Officers and men strain their eyes toward the coast, watching for muzzle flashes or the glow of artillery, but the Sicilian shore remains dark and seemingly silent. The Italians and Germans stationed along this coast do not yet understand what is happening. Intelligence reports suggest coastal defenses are undermanned and poorly prepared, but intelligence can be wrong, and every man in every landing craft knows this. The expectation of machine gun fire, of mines detonating in the shallow water, of being thrown backward into the sea by the force of an artillery round, these expectations heighten every sense, make every second feel like an eternity. The beach grows closer. The rumble of engines is joined by the sound of the sea, of water slapping against the hulls of the assault craft, of men breathing heavily in the darkness. Then the hulls touch bottom and the ramps drop with a splash, and the first assault troops pour out into the shallow water, wading toward the black line of beach that will become their battlefield. American soldiers from the 7th Army hit the sand near Gela and surge forward, weapons held high, moving toward the dunes and the shadows of buildings beyond. The beach is not defended. The shelling has not come. The machine guns have not opened fire. Instead, there is only the sound of splashing water, the splash of boots hitting sand, the harsh breathing of exertion and fear mixing together. Officers shout orders that are barely audible above the sound of more landing craft grinding ashore behind them. Within minutes, hundreds of American soldiers have established a foothold on Sicilian soil. Officers establish a perimeter, calling men into defensive positions, expecting at any moment to hear the crack of rifle fire or the grinding approach of German panzer tanks. Meanwhile, to the southeast, British and Canadian forces land near Syracuse against equally light opposition, the Italian defenders either unprepared, unwilling, or already dispersing into the darkness. The Italian response, when it comes, is hesitant and uncoordinated. Conscripts man the coastal fortifications, men who have spent years fighting in North Africa and have grown weary of war. Some Italian officers order resistance, others decide the cause is already lost and do not press their men to die for a dying nation. Italian artillery opens fire in sporadic bursts, inflicting casualties but lacking the coordination and discipline that would characterize German response. Italian infantry counterattacks materialize in small groups, lacking the cohesion that would be needed to drive the invasion back into the sea. The Allies encounter Italian resistance not as an organized military defense, but as scattered opposition that crumbles when pressed. Prisoners are taken quickly. Some Italian soldiers appear almost relieved to surrender, aware that further resistance is futile. The beaches begin to fill with incoming troops and equipment. Transport vessels approach the shore with supplies, ammunition, medical kits, field rations, replacement weapons. The landing craft shuttle back and forth in a methodical rhythm, each trip bringing more soldiers, more vehicles, more of the vast logistical apparatus required to sustain an invasion. But as the sun rises over the Mediterranean and the Sicilian beaches begin to assume their true appearance, rocky shores, sheltered coves, small towns with red-tiled roofs, German reaction arrives with terrifying speed. Hasso von Manteuffel has positioned his panzer divisions inland, ready to respond to precisely this moment. The first German counterattack comes against the American beachhead near Gela, where the 7th Army has begun to consolidate its position. German tanks, Panzers equipped with dual-purpose guns move toward the beaches with grinding determination, their commanders knowing that the first hours after an amphibious landing are the most critical, that the invasion must be stopped before it becomes impossible to dislodge. The Gela beachhead is still shallow, still vulnerable. Most American anti-tank guns have not yet come ashore. The invasion is not yet more than a few hours old. The German counterattack could work. The German commander believes it will work. American soldiers, having survived the crossing and the landing itself, now face the prospect of being thrown back into the sea by German armor. The sound of German tanks approaching echoes across the beachhead like the grinding of fate itself. Anti-tank fire from American positions near the beach opens up, rifles and small arms cracking out in volleys that do nothing to stop the advancing armor. The Germans return fire with artillery and machine guns, beginning a bombardment of the beachhead that kills and wounds American soldiers caught in the open. Smoke begins to rise from the beaches as German shells find their targets. Some American vehicles burn. Wounded men cry out for medics. The tactical surprise that allowed the initial landings to proceed uncontested has evaporated completely. The Germans know where the Americans are and are determined to push them back into the sea before they can establish themselves too firmly on Sicilian soil. Some American units begin to fall back, not in panic, but in organized withdrawal, moving toward better defensive positions. Officers rally their men, pointing toward hedgerows and stone walls where a defense might be mounted. The German tanks grind forward with terrible inevitability, crushing obstacles, their guns blazing. The beach becomes a chaotic world of smoke and noise, and the terrible clarity of close-quarters combat. And then the offshore naval gunfire arrives like divine intervention. The destroyers and cruisers that have been standing offshore since dawn, their gun crews waiting for exactly this moment, open fire on the German armor approaching the Gela beachhead. The sound of naval artillery is unlike any other, deep and powerful and absolutely final. German tanks explode under the weight of shells fired from ships miles away. Tank crews emerge from burning hulls or do not emerge at all. The momentum of the German attack falters, then halts, then reverses. More German tanks advance to replace those destroyed, but more shells arrive from the ships offshore, a relentless bombardment that turns the approach to the Gela beachhead into a killing ground. The German commander recognizes that his counterattack has failed. Reinforcements are called for, but they will take hours to arrive. By then, more American troops will have come ashore. By then, the American position will be stronger. The German attack breaks apart as the survivors of the initial assault withdraw inland to regroup. The British and Canadian forces moving inland from Syracuse face similar German counterattacks, though less immediately severe. The terrain near Syracuse is more defensible, with scattered villages and olive groves that provide cover. British forces push inland deliberately, establishing positions in the high ground overlooking the beaches, creating layered defenses that can absorb German counterattacks. The Germans throw armor against these positions as well, and again naval gunfire and the growing accumulation of Allied forces ashore repel the attacks. The Axis defenders, both German and Italian, discover during this first day that the Allies have too much firepower, too much determination, and too much capacity to reinforce their position. The Italian commanders increasingly understand that the war is being lost before their eyes. Some order further resistance, others do not. The Germans understand that a static defense cannot work, that the Allies have naval superiority and air cover, that their only hope is to organize a fighting withdrawal and preserve their forces for future battles. By late afternoon on the 10th of July, both the American and British landing zones have expanded considerably. Thousands more soldiers have come ashore. Vehicles and equipment accumulate on the beaches at a rate that cannot be countered by German counterattacks. The weather, which had been feared as a potential disruption, holds favorable. The wind is moderate, the sea is manageable. Transport ships continue to approach the shore. Landing craft continue their shuttle runs. The sound of battle continues. Occasional artillery fire, the distant grinding of tank engines, the crack of small arms fire inland. But the crisis has passed. The landings have succeeded. The beaches are no longer in danger of being thrown back. The foothold in Sicily is secure. The great amphibious invasion that was planned in tents in North Africa, that was doubted by skeptics who believed it impossible, that was feared as certain to fail, has instead succeeded on its first day. The soldiers who wade ashore into this darkness and smoke and danger, the sailors who brought them across the Mediterranean, the commanders who planned every detail and improvised when plans failed, they have achieved the first major invasion of Axis-held European territory. German forces remain on the island, dug in and dangerous. Italian forces are collapsing but still present. The battle for Sicily is only beginning. But the Allies have landed. They have held the beaches. They have proven that an amphibious invasion can work. And they are not going anywhere. The first light of dawn on the 10th of July revealed a precarious foothold. Across Sicily's southern beaches, American soldiers huddled in shallow trenches, dug hastily from sand and rock, watching the horizon for the sound of German engines. The invasion had achieved surprise. This much was undeniable, but surprise alone would not secure Sicily. The real battle, the one that would determine whether Operation Husky lived or died in its infancy, was only beginning. Behind the beachheads, supply ships still labored to unload their cargo, while ammunition and fuel accumulated in makeshift dumps above the waterline. Every soldier knew the history. Landings that seemed successful in their first hours had crumbled under concentrated counterattack. The question that haunted every commander from Eisenhower down to the company sergeant was not whether the Germans would come, but when and in what force. Over the next 3 days, that question would be answered with artillery fire, tank attacks, and desperate hand-to-hand combat that would test whether the Allies could transform a toehold into a genuine invasion. The first hours of the beachhead consolidation were defined by controlled chaos and relentless labor. Soldiers waded back into the surf to help unload landing craft, their shoulders bent under the weight of ammunition boxes, medical supplies, and portable field kitchens. Engineers worked behind them, clearing obstacles that the Italians had hastily planted in the sand, some effective, many not, and marking lanes through which vehicles could pass. Truck drivers navigated narrow beach roads that had become churned into mud despite the arid Sicilian climate, their vehicles spewing dust that hung in the windless air like a beacon visible for miles inland. Anti-aircraft guns were assembled and positioned on slightly elevated ground, their crews scanning the sky for the Luftwaffe fighters they knew would come. The scale of the operation was almost incomprehensible. More than 160,000 troops now ashore or in the process of landing, along with thousands of vehicles, enough ammunition to sustain days of intense combat, and the organizational machinery necessary to keep an invasion army fed, supplied, and coordinated. Yet amidst this vast machinery of war, individual soldiers experienced the invasion as a series of immediate, grinding tasks, carrying supplies, digging deeper trenches, filling sandbags, checking weapons, and waiting for orders that might never come or might come with minutes of warning. The first serious test came on the morning of the 11th of July, less than 24 hours after the assault waves had touched shore. German panzer divisions, positioned inland from the landing beaches, began their response to the invasion. They did not attack in the overwhelming numbers that some Allied planners had feared. The German force structure in Sicily was far smaller than initial estimates had suggested, but what came was nonetheless formidable. Coordinated attacks struck the American beachhead near Gela, where the flat coastal terrain provided ideal ground for tank maneuvers and armored assaults. German commanders understood that the critical moment for an amphibious landing occurs in the first few days, when the invaders are most vulnerable, their supplies limited, their forces compressed into narrow beachheads with the sea at their backs. Push hard enough, the German calculation went, and the Allies could be driven back into the Mediterranean. Push at the right moment, before the Allies could establish sufficient depth to their positions and concentrate overwhelming firepower against a concentrated assault, and the entire invasion might collapse. This understanding drove the intensity of the German response and lent urgency to the scramble for reinforcements that now consumed the attention of every Allied officer, from the beach to the command ships anchored offshore. British and Canadian forces near Syracuse faced their own crescendo of counterattacks, though the terrain in that sector, broken, hilly, and defensible, favoured the defenders less than it did at Gela. The British Eighth Army, under General Montgomery's methodical command, had faced German opposition before in North Africa and had learned to treat German armour with respect and caution. The arrival of German panzer units in the Syracuse sector triggered a shift in tactics. British commanders called for reinforcements, pulled additional artillery into line, and coordinated closely with the naval gunfire support vessels that waited offshore, their powerful guns capable of breaking up German concentrations and suppressing enemy fire with devastating accuracy. The Canadian forces, newer to this scale of combat than either the Americans or British, acquitted themselves with growing confidence as they learned the harsh lessons of modern warfare. Men who had left Canada less than a year before, trained in training grounds on the English coast and the North African desert, now faced real fire and discovered that fear and training could coexist, that discipline held when panic threatened to take over, and that the soldiers next to you in a trench became more important than fear of the unknown. The Canadian advance slowed but did not break. Reinforcements arrived in steady streams, and the critical moment when German counterattacks might have driven the invaders back into the sea passed without the Allies being ejected from Sicily. Supply remained the constant preoccupation and the ultimate vulnerability of every officer managing the beachheads. A landing force far from home, sustained entirely by what could be brought across the water in assault ships and landing craft, depended on an unbroken supply chain that extended back across the Mediterranean to North African ports thousands of miles away. Every shell fired by American or British artillery had to be counted, rationed, and delivered to the guns. Every gallon of gasoline had to be transported, stored, and doled out to vehicles that consumed it in vast quantities. Every man had to eat. Every wounded man had to be evacuated and treated. Every sick soldier had to be removed from the line. The mechanics of supplying an invasion numbered in the thousands of detailed decisions made by quartermasters and logistics officers who never heard a shot fired in anger, but whose competence or failure determined whether the invasion would advance or stall. On the 11th of July, a storm began to brew in the Mediterranean, the kind of sudden violent squall that could turn calm waters into a chaos of waves, wind, and danger to ships trying to anchor offshore. The possibility that this weather could close the beaches, prevent resupply, and leave the Allies stranded without ammunition, food, or fuel concentrated the mind of every commander responsible for maintaining the beachhead. The weather did worsen, beginning on the 12th of July and continuing through the 13th. bringing rough seas, poor visibility, and the constant threat that transport ships would be forced to move to safer anchorages offshore, away from the beaches where supplies were desperately needed. The assault landing craft that had carried the first waves ashore were smaller, more vulnerable vessels, and in heavy seas they could be swamped or damaged beyond utility. The larger transport ships were safer in open water but useless in terms of delivery if they could not approach the beaches. Officers on shore watched the weather with the anxiety of men whose plans depended on conditions they could not control. Some supplies were offloaded to smaller craft and relayed to shore in a laborious and time-consuming process. Some ships turned away from the beaches and anchored in deeper water, their cargo inaccessible until conditions improved. The constant threat that the Allies might find themselves cut off from resupply, trapped on a hostile shore with supplies running low, gave urgency to the need to expand the beachheads, link the separated landing zones into a unified front, and establish deeper positions that could not be pushed back into the sea. The drive to link the beachheads and expand inward began almost immediately after the initial landings. Driven by tactical necessity and strategic vision, American forces pushing inland from Gela encountered stiffening Italian resistance, and then, as German units moved into position, the beginning of coordinated counterattacks. The terrain inland from the American beaches was less favorable for tank combat than the coastal plains, becoming progressively more rugged and broken as the Americans moved away from the sea. This terrain, which would have favored defenders in conventional warfare, here worked in the Allies' favor because it prevented the Germans from concentrating overwhelming armor and forced them to attack piecemeal. British forces advancing northward from Syracuse encountered similar resistance, with German commanders positioning units to slow the British advance while withdrawing most forces toward the interior, where they could consolidate a stronger defensive line. The linkage of American and British beachheads occurred gradually, over the span of 3 days, as patrols from the two armies made contact and supply routes began to run through a unified logistics system rather than two separate, fragile chains. By the evening of the 12th of July, the Allies controlled a continuous front stretching across southern Sicily, with their perimeter expanding inland at varying rates depending on the strength of resistance encountered and the aggressiveness of commanders pushing their units forward. The intensity of combat during these 3 days of consolidation was not the overwhelming, climactic battle that some planners had feared, but rather a series of grinding engagements, ambushes, and counterattacks that wore down both sides. German panzer units struck hard when they attacked, and their armor was superior to the tanks the Allies had brought ashore in the early landing waves. American and British soldiers discovered that the confidence they had felt in training, the belief that they would defeat whatever the Germans threw at them, faced a harsh test against experienced German panzer crews and the power of German anti-tank guns. Tanks burned on the roads inland from Gela. Soldiers died taking and retaking small villages that had no strategic importance beyond their location on the line between Axis and Allied forces. German soldiers, fighting now on soil they did not own, defending an island that had never truly been part of the German Reich, nonetheless held their positions with stubborn professionalism. They retreated when ordered, counterattacked when opportunity offered, and made the Allies pay in blood for every kilometre of ground gained. The human cost accumulated in casualty lists that grew longer with each passing day, each name representing a man who would not go home, who would not walk on familiar streets or embrace family members. The Sicilian sun beat down on soldiers struggling forward under the weight of equipment and fear. The dust of the island penetrated everything, clogging weapons, burning lungs, coating the skin like a fine, gritty layer of discomfort that seemed permanent. Coordination between the American and British forces, between naval gunfire support and ground operations, between air cover overhead and the soldiers advancing across the ground, became the essential skill of this phase of the campaign. Officers who had trained for this moment, who had studied the mathematics of amphibious warfare at command schools, now applied their learning to the harsh reality of actual combat. Radio operators kept units in contact, passing information that translated into coordinated attacks. The concentration of firepower at decisive points, and the coordination of artillery support with infantry advances. Navy gun spotters, moving with the ground forces, relayed coordinates to the battleships and cruisers offshore, calling down fire on concentrations of German armor and infantry positions that were pinning down Allied advances. Aircraft, when they could operate from hastily prepared airfields being constructed in the captured territory, provided additional firepower and reconnaissance, spotting German movements and bringing attacks against columns of vehicles moving toward the front lines. The complexity of this coordination, the requirement that dozens of organizations separated by miles and using different communication systems work in perfect synchronization, represented one of the genuine achievements of this phase of the invasion. Mistakes occurred, and men died from friendly fire or missed communication, but the system held. The beachheads were consolidated, the forces unified, and the foundation laid for the larger offensives that would follow. By the evening of the 13th of July, 3 days after the initial landings, the crisis had passed. The Allies would not be pushed back into the sea. The weather remained challenging, supply lines remained strained, and fierce fighting would continue across the island for weeks to come. But the initial test of whether the invasion could be sustained had been passed. German commanders, seeing that the Allies had successfully consolidated their beachheads, established supply lines that would continue to function despite the weather, and linked their separate landing zones into a unified front, began to shift their strategic thinking toward how to delay and harass the Allied advance, while extracting as many German troops and as much equipment as possible from the island. Italian commanders, increasingly aware that their own government was negotiating with the Allies and that their army was being left to face the Germans alone, began to lose coherence and focus. The moment of maximum vulnerability had passed. The invasion had achieved permanence. From this point forward, the question was not whether the Allies could hold Sicily, but how quickly they could conquer it and at what cost in blood and effort. The consolidation of the beachheads represented the transformation of Operation Husky from an audacious gamble into an operation that was increasingly likely to succeed. The supply ships would continue to arrive, more troops would pour ashore, and the machinery of an invasion army would continue to grind forward, converting captured territory into bases for further advances and transforming the Mediterranean from an Axis lake into an Allied highway. The first real test of the invasion had been passed. The Allies had held their ground, expanded their perimeter, and proven that they could sustain an amphibious operation against determined opposition. Now came the harder phase, the transformation of tactical success into strategic victory. The beach at Gela, on the morning of the 10th of July, was quiet in the way that precedes catastrophe. American soldiers of the 7th Army, having fought their way inland through scattered Italian resistance, believed they had secured a foothold on Sicily's southern coast. Beach master parties organized supply dumps, engineers cleared obstacles from the sand, infantry dug defensive positions among the low hills overlooking the coast. By noon, the beachhead stretched for several kilometers, and reinforcements were flowing ashore from transport ships anchored offshore. What the Americans did not yet understand was that they had landed directly in the path of German counterattack. General Hasso von Manteuffel, the German commander responsible for Sicily's defense, had positioned panzer divisions to respond swiftly to invasion attempts, and Gelle lay squarely within his calculated strike zone. Within 24 hours, the quiet would shatter into one of the fiercest tank engagements of the Sicily campaign. The German response began to coalesce as darkness fell on the 10th. From positions inland and to the west, German armor and motorized infantry units received orders to concentrate at Gelle and drive the Americans back into the sea before they could establish a secure beachhead. The Italians, already demoralized and disorganized, played little role in this counteroffensive. It was German discipline and German armor that threatened American survival. German commanders understood that amphibious beachheads are most vulnerable in their opening hours, when forces are dispersed, supplies are limited, and reinforcements have not yet arrived in overwhelming numbers. If German panzer divisions could achieve local superiority and strike decisively, they believed they might rupture the American line and isolate landing craft from their objective. The race between German concentration and American reinforcement would determine whether Gelle became an American foothold or a German victory. German panzer troops began moving toward the coast in the darkness, engines rumbling across Sicilian roads, unaware that they were about to collide with an enemy far more resilient than their commanders anticipated. The German attacks struck Gelle with tremendous force beginning on the morning of the 11th of July. Waves of panzer tanks and armored vehicles emerged from inland hills, attacking American positions that were still being consolidated. The Americans, hastily organized but combat-hardened from months of warfare in North Africa, scrambled to repel the assault. Tank crews threw their machines into reverse, seeking cover behind any feature that might provide concealment. Infantry dug deeper into their foxholes and prepared anti-tank weapons for desperate work. The fighting was confused and intense, lacking the neat tactical diagrams that planners had drawn in North Africa. Instead, American soldiers faced waves of German armor rolling toward them across open terrain, the roar of engines and cannon fire overwhelming the shouts of officers trying to coordinate defense. American artillery, hastily positioned on the beachhead, opened fire with whatever ammunition was at hand, the guns working their breeches with mechanical rhythm as crews fed shells into the chambers. The beach, so recently quiet, became a cauldron of smoke and noise and terror. What saved the American beachhead in those crucial hours was the presence of naval gunfire support. American and British naval squadrons standing offshore possessed artillery far heavier than anything the German panzers carried. As German attacks pressed forward, American forward observers radioed coordinates to ships standing offshore, and suddenly the sky above the battlefield filled with the shriek of descending shells. Heavy projectiles, some weighing more than a ton, fell upon German formations with devastating effect. Panzer divisions, trained for rapid mobile warfare across open ground, found themselves exposed to artillery fire they could not answer. Tanks were designed to engage other tanks and infantry. They had no defense against plunging fire from naval guns positioned miles beyond the horizon. German commanders quickly discovered that their panzer advantages in armor and firepower meant little when facing the coordinated weight of naval artillery. The offshore guns became the Americans' salvation, breaking up German formations before they could overrun the beachhead, buying time for American reinforcements to arrive and for defenders to strengthen their positions. Over the next 3 days, the pattern repeated itself in brutal alternation. German units would concentrate for an assault, advance with tactical skill and determination, encounter coordinated American defense stiffened by naval gunfire and withdraw to reorganize. American commanders, initially uncertain and grasping for coherent strategy, gradually established command and control systems. General George Patton himself arrived at the beachhead on the 12th of July to assume personal command of operations, his presence energizing American forces with confidence and aggression. Reinforcements continued to flow ashore despite heavy German fire and difficult surf conditions. More tanks, more artillery, more infantry battalions arrived on succeeding tides. The cumulative weight of American reinforcement gradually overwhelmed German advantages in tactical surprise and local concentration. What had begun as a crisis for the American beachhead transformed into a battle of attrition that favored the side with superior supply lines and the capacity to reinforce. German counterattacks continued, but became less frequent and less coordinated as German commanders recognized that their window of opportunity was closing. The struggle around Gela also encompassed intense close-quarters fighting in and around the town itself. American infantry companies fought building by building through the narrow streets, encountering German rearguard elements and Italian troops defending their hometown with varied levels of commitment. These urban engagements lacked the clarity of mobile warfare. Men fired at shadows, grenades exploded in confined spaces, and casualties mounted in conditions where medical evacuation was nearly impossible. American soldiers, many of them 19 or 20 years old, discovered that warfare in towns was more vicious and personal than combat in open country. They learned to clear buildings methodically, to use supporting fire to suppress enemy positions, to press advantages ruthlessly. German soldiers, fighting a delaying action they knew they could not ultimately win, sold their lives dearly before withdrawing. Italian defenders, increasingly aware that their government had begun negotiating with the Allies, fought with diminishing enthusiasm. By the 13th of July, American forces controlled Gela and the surrounding territory, though German forces remained present inland, contesting every ridge and valley position that offered defensive advantage. The casualties from the Battle of Gela reflected the ferocity of the fighting and the scale of forces engaged. American losses totaled more than 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing during the 5-day struggle. German losses approached equal numbers. Italian casualties, though poorly documented, included hundreds killed and thousands captured or dispersed. The beachhead was littered with evidence of violence. Destroyed vehicles, both German and American tanks burned to blackened hulks, abandoned equipment, and graves marked with simple crosses. The beach itself bore the scars of battle. The neat supply dumps and organized positions of the 10th of July were replaced by a chaotic world of shell craters, fortifications, and debris. Yet through this devastation, the American beachhead remained intact. German counterattacks had failed to achieve their objective. American forces had held and expanded their foothold despite tremendous pressure. The battle had proven that disciplined American defense, reinforced by naval gunfire and growing air superiority, could withstand determined panzer assaults. It was a lesson that German commanders would have cause to remember when they faced similar circumstances in Europe. The American victory at Gela came at the cost of shattered illusions about the ease of amphibious warfare. Planners in North Africa had hoped that initial landings would proceed relatively uncontested, allowing American forces to push inland and establish a secure perimeter before encountering German armor. Instead, the Gela fighting demonstrated that German panzer forces could respond with dangerous speed and that amphibious forces were vulnerable to coordinated counterattack. Yet what might have been a disaster became merely a costly victory because of several crucial factors. Superior American naval support, the arrival of reinforcements that transformed initial disadvantage into eventual abundance, and the tactical skill of American commanders and soldiers who adapted to chaos and uncertainty. The battle had also revealed the limitations of Italian resistance. Italian forces, though numerous, lacked the training and motivation to sustain combat against American counterattacks. German forces, by contrast, had fought with characteristic skill and determination, but they could not overcome the physical and logistical advantages that American control of the sea and air provided. As the battle for Gela concluded, German commanders began to recognize a grim reality. They could not defeat the Allies through local counterattack because the Allies possessed the capacity to reinforce and resupply at rates German forces could not match. The battle had become a contest not of German tactical brilliance against American tactical confusion, but rather a confrontation between American industrial might and manpower reserves against German skill and determination. From this point forward, German strategy in Sicily shifted toward preserving forces and executing a fighting withdrawal toward Messina, where German commanders still entertained hopes of conducting an organized evacuation across the strait into Calabria. The Americans, having survived the crisis at Gela and proven their capacity to hold a beachhead against coordinated panzer assault, could now begin the difficult work of expanding their perimeter and driving inland. The battle had established the pattern that would define the remainder of the Sicily campaign. American forces would advance methodically, supported by overwhelming naval gunfire and air superiority, while German forces conducted skilled but ultimately futile delaying actions. The equipment losses sustained during the Battle of Gela also had consequences that extended beyond the island itself. German panzer divisions could replace lost tanks, but only by drawing from reserves committed to other fronts. Every tank destroyed at Gela was a tank that could not be deployed in France or Russia. German commanders were forced to choose between reinforcing Sicily and maintaining other defensive lines, a choice that ultimately favored pulling elite divisions out of Sicily for potential use elsewhere. American losses, by contrast, could be replaced within weeks through continuous shipments from American factories. American soldiers could be replaced through the draft and volunteer enlistment. German manpower reserves, already stretched thin by the demands of the Russian front and occupation duties, were approaching exhaustion. The Battle of Gela thus represented not simply a tactical engagement, but a symptom of deeper strategic imbalances that would ultimately determine the outcome of the war. In the aftermath of the battle, American soldiers who had survived the fighting took time to absorb what they had experienced. Many had fought in North Africa against Italian forces primarily. The encounter with German panzer divisions and German infantry proved a different and far more formidable challenge. They had learned that courage alone was insufficient against armor and concentrated firepower. Survival required discipline, organization, and support from higher levels of the command hierarchy. They had also learned that naval gunfire could achieve effects impossible for ground-based artillery, that air superiority could paralyze enemy movements, and that American industrial capacity could generate reinforcements faster than German forces could mount successive attacks. These lessons, learned in the blood and smoke of Gela, would inform American tactics throughout the remainder of the Mediterranean campaign and beyond. The soldiers who survived Gela had passed through a crucible and emerged hardened, experienced, and capable of facing whatever challenges the conquest of Sicily and the invasion of mainland Europe would present. As American forces consolidated their positions at Gela and prepared to advance inland, the strategic implications of their success became apparent. The German hope of throwing the Allies back into the sea had vanished into the dust of artillery barrages and tank engagements. American forces had established a secure beachhead that could only grow stronger as reinforcements arrived and supplies flowed ashore. The battle had cost both sides dearly, but it had also clarified the military realities of the campaign. The Allies possessed superior resources and support capabilities, while German forces possessed superior tactical skill and training. Yet tactics, however skillful, could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in numbers and supply. The path forward from Gela led inland, toward Messina and the eventual evacuation of German forces that German commanders were already beginning to contemplate. While the American beachhead at Gela stabilized under the weight of naval gunfire and determined infantry, another drama unfolded along Sicily's eastern coast. General Bernard Montgomery's Eighth Army, having swept ashore near Syracuse on the 10th of July, now faced a very different challenge from the Americans to their west, where Patton's forces encountered chaotic Italian resistance and German counterattacks across relatively open terrain. Montgomery's columns were about to discover that the road to Messina would be anything but straightforward. The British commander, methodical and deliberate by nature, had formulated a plan to advance northward along the coastal highway, then wheel inland toward the town of Messina at the island's northeastern tip. What seemed logical on the map would prove far more complicated in execution, as the mountainous interior of Sicily revealed itself to be a defender's paradise. The terrain that Montgomery's forces entered bore little resemblance to the desert expanses where the Eighth Army had earned its reputation during the North African campaign. Sicily's interior rose in progressively steep ridges and valleys, narrow passes where a single well-placed machine gun could hold up an entire battalion, and ancient stone villages perched on hilltops that commanded the surrounding landscape. German engineers, working under the gueplay of experienced commanders who understood Mediterranean terrain, had positioned their forces with meticulous care. Every valley contained prepared defensive positions. Every ridge bristled with artillery observation posts. The roads themselves became potential death traps, winding upward through terrain where vehicles traveling single file presented perfect targets for anti-tank guns hidden in the rocks above. What the Italians had failed to construct through defensive fortifications, the landscape itself now provided to the Axis forces. Montgomery's methodology, which had served him well at El Alamein and in pursuit across North Africa, called for careful reconnaissance, deliberate concentration of force, and methodical advancement. This approach had merits when facing the Afrika Korps in open desert terrain, where maneuver was possible and superiority in numbers could be exploited. In Sicily's interior, however, methodical advancement translated into slow, grinding progress that allowed German commanders to establish successive defensive lines and conduct organized withdrawals. The Eighth Army's lead elements, probing forward from Syracuse, encountered their first serious resistance within days. German paratroopers, fighting with desperate determination, held ridgelines and village positions with a ferocity born from knowledge that this land must be contested long enough for German divisions to escape northward. Every kilometre gained by the British seemed purchased at increasing cost, not in wholesale slaughter, but in the accumulation of casualties through repeated assaults on fortified positions. Supply presented an equally vexing problem for the British advance. The ports through which Montgomery's supplies flowed, Syracuse first, then the smaller harbours captured as the front advanced, quickly became choked with the material demands of an advancing army. The narrow Sicilian roads, already damaged by bombing and sometimes barely passable even before the fighting, could not absorb the volume of trucks necessary to feed both the combat forces and the growing line of transport vehicles stretching back to the coast. German air attacks on these supply lines, though increasingly feeble as Axis air power declined, still inflicted damage and created disruptions. More troublesome still were the purely logistical bottlenecks, unloading ships at damaged harbors, repairing damaged roads, and organizing the complex choreography of supply dumps and transport schedules, while simultaneously conducting combat operations. Montgomery's reputation for careful planning extended to supply arrangements, but even careful planning could not overcome the physical realities of operating through a rugged island with limited infrastructure. The very nature of Montgomery's character and command style, which emphasized caution and deliberation, meant that opportunities for rapid exploitation were often lost while plans were refined and forces realigned. When scouts reported that a particular position might be outflanked, the process of organizing such a maneuver consumed time that allowed German forces to complete their withdrawal to the next defensive line. Montgomery's subordinate commanders, skilled officers though they were, operated within a framework that prioritized the prevention of failure over the exploitation of opportunity. The result was an advance that was steady and relentless, but never break through. The Germans could not stop this methodical pressure, but they could manage and control its rate of advance, conducting fighting withdrawals that inflicted casualties but accomplished their true objective, buying time for German divisions to consolidate, reorganize, and ultimately escape across the Strait of Messina. Inland, meanwhile, General Patton's 7th Army pursued an entirely different strategic approach. Where Montgomery was consolidating and advancing methodically, Patton wheeled westward into Sicily's interior with aggressive abandon. His orders were to secure the interior of the island, prevent Axis forces from consolidating a stronger defensive line across the island's width, and maintain contact with the British advance to ensure the pincer movement squeezed the Axis forces inexorably northward. Patton, by temperament and conviction, believed in speed and exploitation. His columns moved rapidly through Sicily's interior, sometimes outpacing their own supply lines, sometimes engaging enemy forces at disadvantageous odds because the opportunity for swift maneuver presented itself. This approach had hazards. Units could be cut off, supplies could run short. Losses from ambush and accident could accumulate, but it also created a psychological impact among Axis forces that Montgomery's methodical approach could not match. The 7th Army's rapid movement westward achieved something strategically significant. It cut Sicily horizontally, isolating Italian forces in the western portion of the island from the German divisions retreating northward from Syracuse. Italian commanders, already demoralized by news from mainland Italy and uncertain of their government's intentions, began to collapse as organized military units. Some Italian formations surrendered en masse, others simply disintegrated as soldiers abandoned their positions and attempted to make their way home. German commanders, observing this Italian collapse, began redirecting the German units that had been committed to support Italian defenses. Better to concentrate German strength, they reasoned, on maintaining the retreat corridor northward than to waste resources supporting forces that were no longer capable of coherent military action. This strategic reorientation, though subtle, marked the beginning of the end for the Axis position on Sicily. The contrast between the two Allied armies became increasingly apparent to observers and participants alike as the second week of the campaign unfolded. Montgomery's 8th Army was conducting what might be called a classic military operation, methodical, deliberate, concerned with logistics, careful about casualties, and focused on consolidating gains before pushing forward. This approach was not without merit. It produced steady, predictable progress and maintained the cohesion and supply of the attacking force. Yet it also created frustration among officers and soldiers who could see that the enemy was withdrawing, that speed might achieve in days what caution would consume in weeks, and that the very deliberation that prevented disasters also forestalled victories. Patton's Seventh Army, by contrast, was moving with an almost reckless velocity. Supply lines grew ever more tenuous. Units sometimes lost contact with one another in the confusion of rapid movement. Casualties from accidents and ambushes accumulated. Yet there was an undeniable energy to the Seventh Army's operations, a sense that the Allies were not simply following the enemy, but chasing him. That initiative rested with the attacking force rather than the defending. Neither approach was objectively superior to the other. They represented different responses to different problems and different personalities commanding different forces. Montgomery's caution was rooted in a hard-earned recognition that armies in contact with the enemy existed in a state of precarious equilibrium. One mistake, one premature commitment of reserves before the situation was fully understood, could transform tactical defeat into strategic disaster. Patton's aggressiveness reflected both his personality and his perception of the psychological dimensions of warfare. He believed that speed and boldness could achieve effects that firepower and artillery could not, that the enemy's perception of his own defeat could be as important as the material fact of military inferiority. In the context of Sicily, both approaches contributed to the ultimate Allied success, though neither commander would have conceded superiority to the other. As the second week of July progressed, Montgomery's advance along the coastal highway continued at its grinding pace. The British forces captured the town of Vizzini after sharp fighting, then Geritana, then the important road junction at Modica. Each victory required careful coordination of artillery, the positioning of flanking forces, and infantry assaults against positions that had been selected by experienced German engineers and manned by troops who knew that they were fighting for time. The Eighth Army's losses accumulated, not catastrophic, but steady. The German and Italian defenders, by contrast, were losing men they could not replace. More importantly, they were losing real estate, and their commanders knew that the retention of Sicily depended upon their ability to delay the Allies long enough for organized evacuation to begin across the Strait of Messina. Every day gained was a day that more German equipment could be transported northward, more German troops could pass into Calabria, more of the German army could be preserved for future operations. In the wider strategic context, the relationship between Montgomery's Eighth Army and Patton's Seventh Army was shaping the overall trajectory of the campaign. Patton's audacious push westward had widened the gap between the two armies, creating a broad front that stretched across Sicily's width. This expansion meant that German forces could not establish a coherent defensive line. They were forced to fall back continuously, maintaining contact with both the British advance from the south and the American forces pressing from the interior. The pincer movement that Eisenhower's plan envisioned was beginning to take physical form, even if neither Montgomery nor Patton was achieving the rapid breakthrough that planners in their offices might have predicted. The enemy was being pushed northward, territory was being conquered, and the Axis position on Sicily was becoming progressively untenable, even if the enemy was not being annihilated or trapped. By the third week of July, as the campaign entered its second full week, the character of the fighting had begun to shift subtly. Italian resistance, never particularly formidable, was now nearly non-existent. German forces had pulled back from many positions in the interior, concentrating their strength in the mountainous terrain to the north, and establishing defensive lines that extended from the coast near Gela inland through progressively higher and more rugged terrain. These defensive positions were stronger and more cohesive than the scattered delaying positions that had characterized the first weeks of fighting. German commanders, having assessed the strategic situation correctly, were now fighting not for Sicily, but for time, resources, and the preservation of German military power for future struggles. The Eighth Army's methodical advance and the Seventh Army's aggressive exploitation were both now beginning to encounter this more formidable resistance, the kind that suggested the campaign's next phase would be considerably more demanding than its first fortnight. Montgomery pushed forward, methodical and patient. Patton pursued northward, aggressive and unrelenting. The island between them was shrinking, but the space for maneuver that shrinking space provided to German defenders was also decreasing, forcing them to compress their forces, rely on terrain more heavily, and begin organizing the evacuation that would define the campaign's final fortnight. While Montgomery's methodical columns ground northward through Sicily's rocky spine, another drama unfolds across the island's interior. General George Patton, commander of the United States Seventh Army, receives an order that transforms his role from supporting Montgomery's main thrust to something far more ambitious: push westward into Sicily's largely undefended interior, reach the northern coast, and cut the island in half. It is a calculated risk born from intelligence reports suggesting that Italian forces in the west are scattered, demoralized, and unable to mount sustained resistance. Patton, a man who has spent his entire military career waiting for precisely this moment, a chance to demonstrate that speed, aggression, and armored mobility can achieve what careful planning alone cannot, seizes the opportunity with almost reckless enthusiasm. His staff, hardened by the Tunisia campaign, and now confident in their ability to move swiftly across unknown terrain, begins to reorganize the Seventh Army not for methodical advance, but for rapid exploitation. What follows over the next 13 days becomes one of the war's most audacious and celebrated campaigns, a whirlwind of dust, speed, and daring that will change how military commanders think about amphibious follow-up operations. The geography of Sicily itself becomes Patton's weapon and his challenge. The western two-thirds of the island, beyond the zone of initial Allied landings, is rough, sparsely populated, and crisscrossed by primitive roads that wind through valleys and across highlands with little warning. Italian administrative maps are outdated. German intelligence regarding inland defenses is fragmented. American intelligence officers, working from aerial photographs and interrogations of Italian prisoners, estimate that fewer than 30,000 Italian troops occupy the entire western sector, most of them second-line garrison units, without tanks or substantial artillery. German reinforcements, concentrated around Gela and along potential invasion routes, have not yet penetrated this region in force. For Patton, this represents opportunity of the most exhilarating kind: space to maneuver, enemy forces too dispersed to concentrate, and time measured in hours rather than weeks. His orders to his corps and division commanders are characteristically blunt: move fast, bypass resistance rather than slug it out, keep the enemy off balance, and secure the northern coast. The logistics officers blanch at the prospect, knowing that supply lines will stretch to breaking points, that ammunition consumption will outpace resupply, and that vehicles will break down far from repair facilities. Yet Patton has already decided that speed itself is the strategy. If his columns can advance faster than Axis commanders can react or reinforce, the campaign collapses beneath the weight of movement. By the 11th of July, Barely 24 hours after the invasion began, American columns are already pushing inland from the Gela beachhead. Their objective, the town of Licata, roughly 50 kilometers to the west. Armored reconnaissance units, lean and fast, probe ahead, encountering scattered Italian roadblocks that dissolve at the first sign of organized American firepower. Infantry follows in trucks, abandoning the cramped conditions of landing craft for the relative freedom of wheeled transport, though the rough roads ensure every kilometer jolts bones and rattles teeth. Supply trucks struggle to keep pace. The engineers work constantly to repair roads damaged by recent bombing or Italian demolitions, widening tracks barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The sun beats down mercilessly, raising dust clouds visible for kilometers. Dehydration becomes as much an enemy as Italian soldiers. Yet the columns press on, maintaining a pace that astonishes even the American commanders, who have trained for faster warfare but never executed it at such scale and speed. Italian resistance, where it materializes at all, comes from small garrisons surprised by American arrival. Some fight briefly, others, learning that surrender is preferable to futile resistance, raise white flags or simply disappear into the hills. By the 12th of July, Licata falls to advancing American forces, and Patton's headquarters begins to contemplate the truly audacious next step, a direct drive not toward Messina, but toward Palermo, the capital of Sicily, lying roughly 150 kilometers to the northwest. Montgomery, commanding the Eighth Army from his headquarters in the southeast, observes Patton's maneuver with a mixture of admiration and concern. The British general, whose style is cautious, methodical, and grounded in careful logistics, recognizes that Patton is gambling with supply lines and refusing to wait for reserves to consolidate positions. From Montgomery's perspective, Patton's drive risks isolation, surrounded by potentially hostile territory, and cut off from support if anything goes wrong. Yet the intelligence arriving at both headquarters paints a picture of Italian collapse accelerating by the hour, German forces withdrawing northward to prepare for the inevitable retreat toward Messina, and a command structure too fractured to mount coherent resistance. Montgomery, constrained by difficult terrain and strengthening German defenses in his own sector, watches as the American general executes the very kind of rapid exploitation that textbooks advocate but armies rarely achieve. There is no friction between the commanders at this stage. Both are focused on the common goal of securing Sicily. But there is implicit competition, unspoken and professional, between the driving American commander and the calculating British general, each aware that military history will judge their performances. The advance accelerates further over the 13th and 14th of July as Patton's momentum becomes almost hypnotic. Supply officers perform miracles of improvisation, requisitioning Italian trucks abandoned by retreating garrisons, establishing hasty fuel dumps at captured airfields, and pushing forward with ammunition loads that leave virtually no margin for error. The columns move through landscapes of startling beauty: olive groves, vineyards, hill towns with stone walls centuries old. Yet the soldiers see only roads and distances and the thinning resistance ahead. Italian prisoners arrive in growing numbers at processing stations. Thousands of men who have simply decided that continued resistance is pointless, that the Germans can hardly blame them for sitting out the remainder of what everyone increasingly acknowledges is a lost war. German commanders, meanwhile, begin to grasp the scope of what Patton is attempting. Rather than reinforce resistance in the interior, they concentrate their elite divisions for the fight to come in the north, around Messina, where terrain favors defense and where supply lines across the strait remain temporarily secure. The Italian command structure effectively ceases to function. General Guzzoni's orders arrive at division headquarters to find those divisions already moving, scattered, or dissolved into fragments that no longer respond to any authority. By the 18th of July, 8 days after Patton's columns first pushed inland, American reconnaissance units reached the northern coast of Sicily, near the town of Caccamo, effectively cutting the island in half. The speed of the advance stuns observers on both sides. British commanders who believe they have been racing include observers who telegraph back to London descriptions of an American general moving with an audacity that challenges every conventional understanding of supply and logistics. German intelligence is forced to completely revise its estimates of American capability and willingness to accept risk. Italian forces in the western sector, isolated from central command and without realistic prospect of German support, begin either to surrender in mass or to fade away into the hills. Patton, tasting triumph and recognizing that the next logical objective lies directly before him, turns his columns southwestward toward Palermo, the ancient capital of Sicily, sitting on the coast roughly 100 kilometers away. The drive toward Palermo becomes almost ceremonial, an advance through terrain where resistance has fundamentally collapsed, where American soldiers begin to understand that they have participated in something remarkable and historically significant, a campaign that will be discussed in military academies for generations. The roads leading toward Palermo become ribbons of dust and steel, vehicle after vehicle streaming westward under a sky increasingly dominated by Allied air superiority. Italian civilians, having heard rumors of American approach or simply recognizing that the war has effectively ended in their region, emerge from villages and towns to watch the columns pass. Some smile, others watch warily, uncertain what occupation means after years of fascism. American soldiers, dirty, exhausted, and exhilarated, wave from vehicles and distribute cigarettes and chocolate to children who suddenly have become symbols of liberation rather than enemies. The contrast with the brutal fighting around Gela seems almost surreal to men who only days earlier were engaged in close-quarters combat with German armor. Yet the transition makes strategic sense. Italian conscripts and garrison troops have no will to fight. German commanders have deliberately concentrated elite divisions for the defense of northern Sicily, where terrain and proximity to escape routes favor holding action. Palermo's garrison, a mixture of Italian troops and German liaison officers, faces the impossible choice of resisting and being overwhelmed, or evacuating and leaving the prize for capture. The choice is made for them when American columns appear on the city's outskirts, and Italian officers order their men to disperse or surrender. On the 22nd of July 1943, exactly 13 days after the invasion began, American forces enter Palermo to scenes of jubilation that surprise and gratify soldiers who have endured only combat until this moment. Thousands of Sicilian civilians emerge from homes and buildings, waving handkerchiefs, offering wine to American soldiers, embracing men who only days before were absolute strangers. The city itself, damaged by bombing raids in preceding weeks but not devastated, contains enough infrastructure to serve as a supply base for subsequent operations. Allied flags are raised over government buildings. Military administrators begin the process of establishing order and preventing the breakdown of essential services. Patton, his face darkened by sun and dust, enters the city in a jeep and is received as a liberator, despite the cost that liberation has exacted and will continue to exact across the island. Messages flow back to higher command. Palermo captured, Western Sicily secured, Italian forces in the region effectively eliminated as a fighting force. The rapidity of the achievement astonishes even those who authorized it. Supply lines remain taut but intact. Casualties have been modest given the scale of advance, and German forces have been strategically outmaneuvered. Yet the campaign is only partially complete. The real contest for Sicily will now unfold in the north, where German divisions await, where terrain becomes progressively more difficult, and where the relaxed conditions of the past 2 weeks give way to harsh reality. The capture of Palermo represents far more than the seizure of a city. It marks a fundamental demonstration of what modern mechanized armies can achieve when commanded by men willing to take calculated risks and execute with aggressive speed. Patton's 13-day campaign has become the stuff of legend, discussed with awe in American military circles, and analyzed with respect by German officers who recognize that conventional wisdom about supply lines and methodical advance has been upended by an American general who refused to accept limitations. British observers, particularly Montgomery, recognize that Patton has accomplished something that validates the most aggressive school of armored warfare strategy, even as Montgomery's own methodical approach continues to yield results in the more difficult terrain of eastern Sicily. The two generalships represent different philosophies of warfare. The American preference for speed, risk-taking, and exploitation of enemy collapse, versus the British emphasis on careful build-up, supply security, and methodical destruction of enemy forces. Both approaches have merit. Both will prove necessary as the campaign continues. But for this moment, in the suffocating heat of July in 1943, Patton's triumph is undeniable, and the implications for future operations are beginning to crystallize in the minds of strategists and commanders across the Mediterranean. Yet the very success of the Palermo campaign begins to generate unexpected complications in the Allied command structure. Montgomery, whose Eighth Army continues to push northward along the eastern coast against strengthening resistance, begins to feel overshadowed by Patton's audacious achievement. The American general's success, amplified by press reports and radio broadcasts, risks eclipsing the steady, methodical accomplishments of the British Eighth Army, which is fighting in far more difficult terrain against better prepared German defenses. Eisenhower, the supreme commander, must navigate the increasingly fraught relationship between his two most capable subordinates, both of whom now recognize that the race to Messina has become personal as well as strategic. Patton, flush with victory, lobbies for greater resources and authority to drive directly northward along Sicily's western coast toward Messina. Montgomery argues for a coordinated strategy that prevents Patton from advancing too far beyond secure supply lines and ensures that German forces cannot exploit separation between American and British forces. The headquarters politics become as complex as the tactical situation, though the fundamental strategic reality remains unchanged. German forces are withdrawing northward, Italian forces have effectively surrendered, and the Allies must now decide how aggressively to pursue and whether to attempt the dangerous maneuver of cutting off the German escape route across the Strait of Messina. The 13-day sprint to Palermo has accomplished what its architects intended. The western half of Sicily is secured, Italian forces in that region have been neutralized, and the Allies have demonstrated their growing mastery of rapid exploitation following amphibious landings. American confidence soars. Soldiers understand they have participated in something genuinely remarkable, and the strategic situation in the Mediterranean continues to shift decisively toward Allied advantage. Yet the campaign has also revealed the limitations of speed when divorced from overall strategic coordination. The dangers of allowing pursuit of tactical success to obscure the larger operational picture, and the complexity of managing multiple commanders operating under the stress of actual combat operations. As Patton's columns begin to regroup and prepare for the final phase of Operation Husky, the drive toward Messina and the attempt to trap German forces before they escape across the strait, the campaign enters its most critical and dangerous stage. The speed that has characterized American operations in western Sicily cannot be maintained indefinitely. Terrain, German resistance, and the inherent friction of warfare will reassert themselves. Yet the capture of Palermo stands as testimony to what aggressive command, swift movement, and tactical audacity can accomplish when conditions align and an entire army moves with coordinated purpose toward a single objective. In the opening days of July 1943, while tanks ground forward across Sicily's dusty interior and soldiers dug foxholes in unfamiliar terrain, a far different struggle was unfolding in Rome, a battle waged in marble corridors and palace gardens, where ideology and survival collided with the weight of military defeat. The invasion of Sicily was supposed to unite Italians behind their fascist leadership, to galvanize the nation in defense of its own soil. Instead, it exposed the rot that had grown at the heart of Mussolini's regime, a dictatorship sustained not by popular will, but by fear, propaganda, and the loyalty of men who had grown weary of fighting a war they could no longer win. As Operation Husky unfolded on the beaches and hillsides below, the Italian political establishment began to splinter, and the man who had promised eternal glory to the Italian people faced his final reckoning. For 20 years, Benito Mussolini had ruled Italy through sheer force of personality and the machinery of totalitarian control. He had transformed a chaotic nation into a disciplined state, rebuilt its military, and seized Ethiopia and Albania in campaigns that seemed to validate his vision of a new Roman Empire. Yet by the summer of 1943, that vision had crumbled into ash. Italian forces had been routed across North Africa. Their navy had been decimated. Their cities were being bombed with increasing frequency, and now foreign troops were trampling across Italian soil itself. The Italian people, never as ideologically committed to fascism as their German allies, had begun to lose faith. Food was rationed, young men were dying in distant theaters, and the promise of fascist grandeur seemed increasingly hollow against the reality of military collapse and national humiliation. The Italian Fascist Party itself had become a house divided. Many of Mussolini's earliest supporters, the so-called RAS, powerful regional bosses who had helped him consolidate power, had grown resentful of the dictator's recent alliance with Nazi Germany. They had joined the fascist movement because it promised Italian glory, not servitude to Berlin. They resented the way German military leadership increasingly dictated strategy in the Mediterranean, the way German divisions occupied Italian territory, and the way German officers treated Italian allies with thinly concealed disdain. Even within the military hierarchy, officers who had served Italy for decades felt their nation being reduced to a vassal state, their professional honor compromised by subordination to German command. The invasion of Sicily became the catalyst that transformed these simmering tensions into open crisis. The Grand Council of Fascism, Italy's supreme governing body, had not met since 1939. On the 16th of July, as German counterattacks raged at Gela and American forces pushed inland toward Palermo, Dino Grandi, a senior fascist hierarch and former foreign minister, began quietly organizing fellow council members to convene for the first time in 4 years. Grandi and his allies did not speak openly of removing Mussolini. Such language would have been suicidal. Instead, They framed the meeting as a necessary discussion of Italy's military situation and the need to revitalize the regime's flagging support among the population. They drafted resolutions that appeared to affirm fascist solidarity, while actually proposing that Mussolini surrender his military powers and restore the authority of King Victor Emmanuel III, who had been relegated to ceremonial impotence for 2 decades. It was a subtle coup disguised as institutional reform, a knife concealed beneath a crown. Mussolini, consumed by illness and increasingly disconnected from reality, initially dismissed the council's request to meet. He had grown older and frailer since the early years of his regime. His jaw was weak, his posture stooped, and his mind, once quick and dominating, now wandered and seized upon grandiose fantasies. He was taking medications for stomach ailments and syphilis. He suffered from chronic fatigue and depression. Yet he was also the man who had dominated Italy for 2 decades, and the very thought of the Grand Council convening without his full control enraged him. On the 24th of July, he finally agreed to meet, convinced, or perhaps hoping, that he could still impose his will on the assembly and bend them to his purposes. The Grand Council met in the Palazzo Venezia late on the evening of the 24th of July. Mussolini, wanting to project authority, arrived wearing a military uniform and spoke for nearly 2 hours, attempting to convince the assembled fascist leaders that Germany would soon deploy new weapons that would turn the tide of the war, that the invasion of Sicily was merely a temporary setback, that Italian resolve must stiffen, not crumble. Yet his words rang hollow in ears that could hear artillery fire in Sicily and read casualty reports that grew more grim by the hour. The council members listened with varying degrees of skepticism, their faces revealing a gulf between what Mussolini was saying and what they knew to be true. As the night wore on, speaker after speaker rose to express doubt, to question the alliance with Germany, to suggest that Italy's continued participation in the war was not heroism, but suicide. Dino Grandi presented his resolution in the early hours of the morning, and it passed by a vote of 19-7. The resolution ostensibly reaffirmed fascist principles while proposing that the king assume full authority over the armed forces, effectively stripping Mussolini of military command and reducing him to a figurehead. Mussolini's face darkened as the vote was announced. He understood perfectly what had occurred, though the language used had been oblique and parliamentary in form. He dismissed the council, but his dismissal was no longer the command of an absolute dictator. It was the gesture of a man who had already lost control. He drove back to his residence, the Villa Torlonia, exhausted and trembling with rage and fear. He had been voted out of power in his own capital, humiliated by men he had elevated, betrayed by the very party he had created. The following day, the 25th of July, Mussolini was summoned to meet with King Victor Emmanuel III at the royal palace. The meeting was brief and formal. The king, a diminutive man who had been almost invisible during Mussolini's reign, informed the dictator that he was being placed under arrest on the sovereign's authority. Mussolini protested weakly, then acquiesced. Perhaps he was too shocked to resist, or perhaps he believed that his arrest would be temporary, a symbolic gesture to satisfy the growing discontent among the Italian people. He was escorted from the palace not in chains but in an ambulance, and within hours he was transferred to a military barracks on the island of Ponza in the Tyrrhenian Sea, far from Rome and far from his remaining supporters. The man who had promised to lead Italy to immortal greatness had been overthrown not by foreign invasion or military defeat, but by his own party, his own government, and his own king. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, an elderly general and royalist who had served in the Italian army since before Mussolini was even born, emerged as Mussolini's successor. Badoglio was no liberal. He was a monarchist and a soldier, and he had himself authorized Italian atrocities in Ethiopia during the colonial campaign of the 1930s. Yet he was also a man of strategic clarity, a military professional who understood that Italy could not continue fighting a war it was already losing. His first public act was to announce that Italy remained loyal to the Axis and that the war would continue. This announcement was intended to keep German commanders from immediately occupying the entire peninsula and to prevent panic among the population. It was a transparent fiction, and everyone knew it was a fiction, but it bought Badoglio time to begin secret negotiations with the Allies for an armistice, time to organize the Italian government, and time to begin the agonizing process of extricating Italy from the Axis alliance. The news of Mussolini's fall sent shockwaves through the military command structures that were already reeling from the invasion of Sicily. Italian field commanders in Sicily found their orders increasingly contradictory and their authority increasingly unclear. Were they to continue fighting under Badoglio's command? Were they to await further instructions? Should they be preparing to negotiate with the Allies? The chaos was compounded by the German presence. German generals had never fully trusted their Italian counterparts, and they had positioned German divisions not only to fight the Allies, but to keep Italian forces under observation and prevent any precipitous Italian withdrawal. When news of Mussolini's arrest reached German headquarters, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and the German command immediately began moving elite SS and Wehrmacht divisions northward, preparing to occupy Rome and central Italy, disarm Italian forces, and prevent Italy from signing any separate armistice with the Allies. The German response was swift and cold. Albert Kesselring, the German commander-in-chief in Italy, had already begun preparing contingency plans. Operation Axa, as it was codenamed, for the seizure of Italian territory and the elimination of Italian forces as independent military actors. German troops began moving toward Rome, toward the strategically vital passes in the Apennines, and toward the Italian coast. Italian generals found themselves in an impossible position. They could not openly defy the Germans without inviting immediate occupation and the destruction of what remained of their army, yet they were also being pressured by their new government to begin moving away from the German alliance. Some Italian divisions received contradictory orders. Some commanders attempted to hedge their bets by appearing loyal to both Germans and their new government simultaneously. The result was paralysis, a paralysis that would prove catastrophic for Italian soldiers in the weeks ahead. Within days of Badoglio's assumption of power, emissaries from the new Italian government were meeting secretly with Allied commanders to discuss armistice terms. General Giuseppe Castellano, an Italian officer trusted by Badoglio, traveled to Lisbon and then to North Africa to negotiate with Eisenhower's representatives. The Allies, having achieved their immediate objective in Sicily and looking ahead to the invasion of the Italian mainland, saw the possibility of an Italian surrender as a tremendous strategic gift. If Italy withdrew from the war, German forces would be forced to occupy the entire peninsula without Italian assistance, stretching German resources even more thinly across an already overextended front. The Italian surrender would not end the fighting in Italy. In fact, it would prolong it, as Germans would have to occupy and defend territory they previously could count on Italians to control, but it would remove the fiction of Axis unity and force Germany to fight alone on a new front. The armistice negotiations moved forward in secret, while Badoglio maintained the pretense of Italian loyalty to the Axis. German commanders, suspicious and increasingly certain that Italy was betraying them, accelerated their timetable for occupation. By the end of July, German soldiers were moving into Rome. By early August, German divisions were fanning out across the peninsula, occupying airfields, seizing supplies, and positioning themselves to disarm Italian forces. Italian officers found themselves in a nightmare scenario. They could not openly resist the Germans without provoking immediate, overwhelming military action. Yet they could not openly cooperate without betraying Badoglio's secret negotiations with the Allies. Many simply stood aside and let events unfold, paralyzed by divided loyalty and fear of the consequences of choosing the wrong side. The morale collapse within the Italian military in Sicily was almost instantaneous once the news of Mussolini's fall became known. Soldiers who had already been exhausted and demoralized by weeks of fighting now questioned whether they were fighting for a government that no longer existed, in service of an alliance their new leaders seemed to be abandoning. Italian units began to fracture. Some withdrew in good order, others scattered, and still others simply sat in their positions awaiting further orders that never came with clarity. The German command, watching this unraveling with contempt and frustration, began accelerating their own withdrawal plans, organizing fighting retreats that would eventually carry German forces across the Strait of Messina and into Calabria. The Italian army in Sicily, which had numbered roughly 200,000 men at the start of the invasion, was ceasing to function as a coherent military force. Soldiers surrendered in increasing numbers to the advancing Allies. Others simply deserted and attempted to make their way home. Still others found themselves trapped between German forces attempting to evacuate them and Allied forces advancing northward. The collapse of Italian military authority was mirrored by the collapse of Italian governmental coherence. Badoglio's government was operating in a state of constant tension, attempting to prepare for an armistice while maintaining the appearance of continued Axis loyalty. The Italian bureaucracy, the fascist party apparatus, the military command structure, all of these institutions were fragmenting as men scrambled to position themselves for whatever came next. Some officials began destroying documents and evidence of their participation in fascist crimes, attempting to erase their own culpability. Others began attempting to make contact with the Allies, hoping to arrange favorable treatment or to negotiate positions in whatever government might follow the war. The state itself, it seemed, was coming apart, hollowed out by ideological bankruptcy and military defeat. By late July and early August, the most significant consequence of Mussolini's fall had become clear. Italy was no longer a functional member of the Axis alliance. The pretense of Axis unity, never entirely convincing, had shattered. The German command would now have to occupy and defend Italian territory without meaningful Italian assistance. The Wehrmacht divisions that had come south to fight the Allies would now have to be reinforced and expanded to occupy an entire nation. And as German forces extended themselves across the peninsula, preparing for what would become a brutal, prolonged defensive campaign, the Allies sensed an opportunity. The invasion of Sicily had been the first blow. The armistice negotiations were the opening to a second, even more ambitious stroke. The collapse of Mussolini's regime marked not the end of fighting in Italy, but the beginning of an entirely different conflict, one in which Germans would fight alone, without allies, to defend a peninsula they now occupied as a conquered land rather than as partners in a shared cause. The political collapse of Italy in late July 1943 thus set the stage for everything that would follow on the Italian mainland. By the 23rd of July 1943, the strategic world of Sicily had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as a desperate German gamble to hurl the Allies back into the sea had transformed into a fighting withdrawal of necessity. The Italian Sixth Army was dissolving not from tactical defeat alone, but from political collapse radiating out of Rome. Mussolini's arrest 2 days earlier had sent shockwaves through the Italian chain of command, undermining the will to resist among conscripted soldiers already worn down by years of North African warfare. German commanders, seasoned in the art of military adaptation, recognized the moment. General Hasso von Manteuffel and his subordinates made a calculated decision: consolidate the German forces, abandon the notion of holding Sicily in its entirety, and prepare an organized fighting retreat northward toward the strait that separated Sicily from mainland Italy. That narrow channel, little more than a few kilometers wide at its narrowest point, became the lifeline upon which German hopes depended. The race to Messina, therefore, was not a contest merely of military honor between two ambitious generals, though that element surely existed. It was, more fundamentally, a race against time itself, a contest between the speed of Allied advance and the disciplined withdrawal of a Wehrmacht that had no intention of being trapped on an island. General George Patton's Seventh Army, positioned in the western interior after its rapid westward sweep through Sicily, possessed a significant advantage in proximity to Messina. The strategic logic was straightforward. Messina lay roughly 150 kilometers to the northeast of Palermo, which Patton's forces had captured just the previous day. By striking directly northeastward across the interior, Patton could potentially cut off the German withdrawal and prevent the evacuation of thousands of soldiers and invaluable equipment across the strait. The American general, known for his aggressive impulses and his competitive drive, threw his full energy into this objective. General Montgomery's British Eighth Army, by contrast, faced a longer and more tortuous route. Having advanced northward from Syracuse on the southeastern coast, Montgomery's forces had to navigate the mountainous spine of Sicily, terrain that favored defense and slowed mechanized advance significantly. The road to Messina from the south and east was a winding gauntlet through valleys and passes where German engineers could plant obstacles, demolish bridges, and position rearguard elements with precision. Yet Montgomery, bound by his methodical operational doctrine and his confidence in British military tradition, was determined that his forces would reach Messina first. What emerged was an unspoken but nonetheless intense competition between two senior commanders, each driving their respective armies forward with heightened urgency, each seeking the prestige and strategic validation that would come from capturing Messina. This rivalry, though informal and never explicitly acknowledged in official communications, injected an additional layer of momentum into the Allied campaign. The terrain through which both armies had to fight became the arbiter of speed and suffering. Sicily's interior, particularly the northern reaches, is a world of steep ridges, deep valleys, and tight passes where a small defending force can impose disproportionate delay upon a larger attacker. The roads available to advancing armies were often narrow, winding through villages and over passes that could be easily cratered by retreating engineers or defended by small groups of soldiers with anti-tank weapons positioned on high ground. German units, under the command of officers trained in the science of delaying actions, understood exactly how to exploit this terrain. They would establish a defensive line, hold it briefly to inflict casualties and consume time, then withdraw to the next prepared position further north. This pattern repeated itself dozens of times over the course of the push toward Messina. The fighting became characterized by constant skirmishes rather than grand set-piece battles, by the grinding attrition of village-to-village combat, by the necessity of outflanking and encircling positions that could not be taken head-on. American forces, particularly those under Patton's direct command, became increasingly impatient with this pace. Tank columns pushed ahead of supporting infantry. Supply lines became dangerously stretched. Soldiers drove forward on little sleep, driven by their commander's determination to reach Messina. The human cost of this acceleration, though less catastrophic than it might have been, remained significant. Casualties mounted from accident and enemy fire both. Throughout the final days of July and into early August, the northern coast of Sicily became a region of intense fighting and dramatic movement. Patton's forces drove up the northern coastal road, seeking to seize key towns and ports along the way. The town of Palermo fell on the 22nd of July. Within days, American forces had advanced further northeastward, along the coast, toward the town of Milazzo, roughly 60 kilometers from Messina. German commanders, recognizing the danger posed by this coastal thrust, committed additional forces to block the American advance. Every kilometer of progress required combat, required the reduction of German defensive positions, required the commitment of artillery and air support to blast through obstacles. Yet Patton's drive possessed an almost irresistible momentum. The Americans were learning, through hard experience, how to conduct rapid mechanized warfare with increasing skill. Tank crews became more experienced. Infantry developed better coordination with armor. Supply columns learned to maintain forward momentum even under difficult conditions. The British, meanwhile, pushed northward from Syracuse along the eastern coast toward the town of Catania, which lay roughly halfway between Syracuse and Messina. Catania became the focal point of Montgomery's advance, a strategic position that controlled the main road northward and thus became the object of fierce fighting. The British Eighth Army, with all its methodical planning and careful preparation, found itself locked in a grinding struggle for the city and its surrounding terrain. German defenders, fighting with the discipline and professionalism that had become their hallmark in Sicily, contested every approach. By early August, the lines of advance had become clearer, and with that clarity came an acceleration of the entire campaign. Patton's forces, having fought through increasingly desperate Italian and German resistance, were approaching the town of Messina from the west. The coast road, though difficult, offered the most direct route, and American mechanized forces pressed hard along this axis. Behind Patton's leading troops, massive columns of vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks carrying supplies and ammunition, stretched back toward Palermo, creating a supply line that was stretched to its absolute limit. The pace was punishing for the troops involved. Soldiers went days with minimal sleep, sustained on rations and adrenaline, driven forward by orders that brooked no delay. The Germans, fully aware of the American approach, prepared their defensive positions around Messina with care. The city itself, sitting on the strait that separated Sicily from mainland Italy, was the ultimate objective, not merely a military position of tactical importance, but a symbol of operational success or failure. If the Allies could seize Messina before the German forces had completed their withdrawal across the strait, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and vast quantities of equipment could potentially be trapped on the island. This calculation drove the urgency on both sides. The Allies pushed with desperation to close the net, while the Germans, despite their fighting withdrawal, maintained extraordinary discipline in extracting their forces. Montgomery's advance proved slower and more costly than Patton's, but it was no less determined. The British commander, methodical by nature and training, refused to be rushed into tactical errors that might have increased casualty rates among his troops. The Eighth Army fought its way through the mountainous interior, contesting each valley, each ridge, each defended position with patience and systematic application of overwhelming force. German rearguard units, often composed of elite troops and well-trained junior officers inflicted sharp casualties on British forces attempting to dislodge them from prepared positions. Yet the German soldiers also understood the strategic imperative: hold long enough to allow the main body to withdraw, but not so long as to risk encirclement. This balance required judgment, leadership, and the ability to disengage under fire, skills that German military training emphasized. British forces, pushing northeastward, gradually shortened the distance between themselves and Messina, even as Patton's Americans pushed from the west. The two armies, in effect, were converging on the same objective from different directions, each seeking to arrive first, each driving their troops forward with intensity that reflected not just military necessity, but also the personal stakes involved for the commanding generals. The human dimension of this race became visible in countless small moments that punctuated the larger campaign. Exhausted American soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time just weeks earlier, pushed forward with a mixture of fear and determination that manifested in sharp, vicious fighting in small villages. British troops, battle-hardened from years of North African warfare, moved with the measured professionalism of veterans, yet even they felt the pressure of the accelerating pace. German soldiers, fighting in a withdrawal that was becoming increasingly desperate, nonetheless maintained the formations and fire discipline that had made them formidable opponents. Some surrendered, many chose to continue fighting rather than face capture. Others simply fell in the continuing skirmishes that characterized this advance. The losses, while mounting, remained secondary in the minds of commanders focused on seizing Messina before the Germans could complete their extraction. Supply lines became strained nearly to the breaking point. Trucks carrying ammunition and fuel fought their way along roads congested with tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, and the endless columns of supporting vehicles necessary to sustain modern mechanized warfare. Pilots flying fighter bombers sortied repeatedly in the summer heat, striking German positions ahead of advancing ground forces, seeking to blast away defensive obstacles that might slow the advance. Naval gunfire support from offshore vessels provided another source of crushing firepower that the Germans had to contend with on the coast roads. As the final days of the campaign approached, a kind of frenetic energy seized both armies. The end was near. Everyone could sense it. The Germans were racing against the clock to complete their withdrawal. The Allies were racing to prevent it. This culminating phase saw some of the most desperate and chaotic fighting of the entire campaign. German commanders made the calculation that they could hold certain positions long enough for critical units to cross the strait, then withdraw the rearguard themselves. This meant that German soldiers in defensive positions often found themselves abandoned as the strategic situation shifted. Some chose to fight to the end, accepting capture or death rather than surrender, while others quietly melted away into the countryside. American forces, pushing hard on the northern coastal road, fought through the town of Milazzo in early August, with intense house-to-house combat. British forces, pushing from the south and east, pressed toward Catania with grim determination, finally breaking through German resistance there on the 5th of August after weeks of fierce fighting. Once Catania fell, the road to Messina opened more fully to British advance. Yet even with Catania secured, the journey from the captured city to Messina itself still required days of additional fighting as German rearguard units contested every position. The Germans, it became clear, would not surrender their disciplined withdrawal to the chaos of complete defeat. They would continue to fight, continue to contest ground, continue to extract their forces across the strait, even as the jaws of the Allied advance closed around them. The intensity of the fighting during this final phase reflected the desperation of the strategic moment. The Axis powers understood, perhaps more clearly than the Allies themselves, the significance of what was happening. If large numbers of German forces could be evacuated across the strait, the Wehrmacht would retain experienced troops and commanders to defend mainland Italy against the invasion that everyone recognized must eventually come. If, conversely, German forces were trapped on Sicily and forced to surrender, the psychological and strategic impact would be enormous. For the Allies, the capture of Messina itself was important, but the prevention of German evacuation was potentially transformative. Every day that passed, every kilometer that German forces retreated northward, increased the proportion of the Wehrmacht that would reach mainland Italy. The race, therefore, was not merely about military prestige or the satisfaction of competitive ambitions between commanders. It was, at the deepest level, about the shape of the war that would follow, about the price in blood that would be paid in Europe over the subsequent months and years. By the 16th of July, American forces, driving with almost reckless speed and aggression, had reached the outskirts of Messina from the west. They had covered the distance from Palermo to Messina in roughly 2 weeks, a feat of rapid mechanized warfare that astonished observers on both sides. Yet when they attempted to enter the city, they encountered stubborn German resistance in prepared defensive positions surrounding the urban area. The Germans were not prepared to hand Messina to Patton without a fight. Instead, they organized a final defensive arc around the city, buying precious time for the last units to cross the strait. British forces, meanwhile, approached from the south and southeast, methodically breaking through German positions and advancing toward the city as well. What unfolded was a final phase of intense fighting around Messina itself, with American and British forces converging on the city, while German defenders held firm in fortified positions. The race had become a siege. The siege, in turn, reflected the larger truth of the campaign. The Germans had made their strategic choice, and now they executed it with discipline and skill. The Allies had demonstrated their growing capacity to conduct large-scale operations across difficult terrain against a formidable opponent, but they had been narrowly bested in the race to prevent German evacuation. The implications of this outcome would become clear only in the bitter fighting that would follow on mainland Italy and beyond. The narrow waters of the Strait of Messina, at their widest point merely 4 kilometers across, became the threshold between capture and escape. On one shore, the ruins of Sicily; on the other, mainland Italy and the waiting German army. For General Hasso von Manteuffel and his commanders, this strait represented both salvation and a race against time. The Allies had proven faster and more aggressive than many German officers had anticipated, yet the Wehrmacht retained one crucial advantage. They had anticipated this very moment. While the Italians collapsed into political chaos and military confusion, German planners had already begun preparing their withdrawal across the water. This was not a rout or a panicked flight. What unfolded across those final days was instead a calculated, methodical evacuation, a masterclass in military discipline under pressure, even as the noose tightened. German engineers and logisticians had begun assembling a fleet of sorts weeks earlier, requisitioned from Italian stocks or hastily converted from available vessels. Ferries that had once carried civilians and automobiles were retrofitted with anti-aircraft guns and converted into troop transports. Fishing boats, tugboats, and barges were pressed into service. Motor transport vessels designed to ferry amphibious assault craft were loaded instead with men and materiel. The Germans established a flow like a machine, trucks and tanks arriving at embarkation ports on the Sicilian side, being loaded onto whatever transport could be found, and being shuttled across the strait under darkness. By daylight, the vessels would be hidden, anchored in protected coves, or camouflaged against the shoreline. When night fell again, the ferries would return to load another batch of soldiers, vehicles, and supplies. This rhythm, maintained night after night, became the heartbeat of German survival. The Allies watched this evacuation occurring with mounting frustration and alarm. Air reconnaissance reported vessels moving across the strait. Naval intelligence intercepted radio transmissions that suggested large-scale movement of troops and equipment. The problem confronting Allied commanders was one of geometry and darkness. The strait, though narrow, was wide enough that fighter bombers operating from Sicily during daylight hours had only limited time to strike targets before fuel constraints forced them to return. Moreover, the Germans operated their ferries almost exclusively between dusk and dawn, when Allied air power became largely ineffective. Daylight bombing runs against the beaches and embarkation points achieved some success, destroying supplies and inflicting casualties among troops waiting to cross. But the core evacuation continued largely unimpeded. The Allies possessed air superiority over Sicily, yet that superiority meant little when deployed against an enemy movement that had learned to hide in darkness. Naval attempts to interdict the evacuation proved equally frustrating. British and American naval forces lacked sufficient fast craft to establish a continuous blockade. Destroyers and patrol boats could harass German vessels, and some transport ships were in fact sunk or damaged. But the strait's width and the German practice of running multiple vessels simultaneously meant that losses were sustainable. The Allies attempted several amphibious landings on the Calabrian shore to cut off the evacuation at its destination, but these operations proved hastily organized and lacked the surprise that had characterized the initial invasion of Sicily. German defenders on the Italian side of the strait, though fewer in number than those in Sicily, nonetheless mounted sufficient resistance to prevent the Allies from establishing a foothold from which they could threaten the evacuation beaches. One amphibious assault, launched without adequate air support and with insufficient ground forces, was repulsed with heavy losses. Another never reached its objective as rough seas scattered the landing craft before they could beach. The photographs and testimonies from those days tell a story of controlled urgency. German soldiers stood in long lines on the beaches, waiting their turn to board vessels that seemed absurdly small for the task assigned to them. Tank commanders watched as their machines, coated in dust from days of fighting, were winched aboard ferries that sagged under the weight. Medical orderlies tended to wounded men who had fought their way through Sicily and now faced a journey across water that, though brief, felt like crossing an ocean. The German army had learned through bitter experience in Russia and North Africa that retreat required discipline. Panic led to collapse. Officers enforced order with stern voices and sharp movements. Soldiers maintained their formations and obeyed commands. Discipline held where it might easily have fractured. Yet losses mounted regardless of organization. Allied aircraft continued their attacks at dawn and dusk, catching transports in the moments when they emerged from cover or approached their landing zones. Barges were struck and sunk. Ferries were set ablaze and left to drift. Some vessels were lost with all hands, their soldiers never reaching the Italian shore. Anti-aircraft fire from German positions across the strait kept Allied bombers at altitude, reducing accuracy, but hits still occurred with regular frequency. The Germans lost vessels throughout the evacuation, and every ship lost meant another delay, another batch of soldiers waiting one more night on the Sicilian beaches. Supply ships were deprioritized in favor of personnel ferries. Tanks and artillery were abandoned or destroyed rather than left for the Allies to capture. This was a withdrawal that preserved soldiers at the cost of equipment, manpower at the cost of firepower. The weather became both curse and blessing. A sudden storm that swept across the strait in mid-evacuation grounded most German transport operations for nearly a day, but it also drove Allied aircraft to shelter, preventing bombing runs that might otherwise have inflicted severe damage. When the storm cleared, German commanders seized the opportunity to push the evacuation into overdrive, running multiple vessels throughout the night and continuing operations into the early morning hours with minimal air opposition. Soldiers testified afterward to the surreal quality of those final nights, the sense of standing at the precipice between capture and freedom. Some men slept on the beaches while awaiting transport, too exhausted to remain alert. Others remained vigilant, scanning the dark water for approaching naval vessels or the first signs of dawn that would bring the bombers. What made the evacuation possible, beyond German discipline and Allied mistakes, was the sheer complexity of conducting a large-scale amphibious interception against an opponent prepared for it. The Allies had not expected to face an organized withdrawal. They had expected a rout, a desperate scramble that would result in German forces trapped on the island. Instead, they discovered that German officers had anticipated precisely this scenario and prepared accordingly. The Wehrmacht had learned from Sicily that it could not hold against American and British forces once they achieved numerical superiority and air dominance. Rather than fight to the last man, German commanders made the rational choice: preserve the army for future battles on the mainland. This decision, militarily sound though it was strategically frustrating for the Allies, demonstrated the Wehrmacht's capacity to adapt and survive, even as the larger strategic situation deteriorated. By the 16th of July, the evacuation had moved beyond the point where the Allies could realistically halt it. American and British forces, now fighting their way toward Messina, were aware that the bulk of German strength was already across the strait or committed to the rearguard covering the evacuation. The Allies pushed forward with renewed urgency, hoping to arrive at the embarkation ports before the last German soldiers could escape. Patrols raced through towns and over ridges, seeking to reach the Strait of Messina before the German movement concluded. But German rearguard units, fighting with the skill and ferocity that had characterized their resistance throughout the campaign, continued to contest every advance. These soldiers knew their mission: hold long enough for the evacuation to be completed, then withdraw across the water themselves. Some of them understood, with grim clarity, that they might not make it across. The final vessels carrying German troops departed the Sicilian shore in the pre-dawn hours of the 17th of July. Senior commanders were among the last to cross, unwilling to abandon their posts until the evacuation was confirmed complete. Some German officers, watching from the Italian shore as Allied forces finally entered the abandoned embarkation ports, felt the bitter weight of knowing how close they had come to disaster and how narrowly they had escaped it. Estimates of German strength evacuated ranged from approximately 65,000 to 70,000 troops, along with thousands of vehicles and large quantities of supplies. Not every soldier could be evacuated. Some were left behind to hold rearguard positions, and many of them became prisoners of the advancing Allies. Not every tank or gun could be saved. Much valuable equipment was destroyed or abandoned. Yet the core of the German force, the experienced divisions that had fought so tenaciously in Sicily, emerged intact to fight again in Italy. The Allies, meanwhile, occupied the evacuated beaches and ports of the strait, finding them nearly empty of German military strength, but full of evidence of the organized retreat that had just concluded. Dock facilities were damaged but not completely destroyed, suggesting German forethought in their demolition plans. Abandoned supplies lay scattered, some deliberately destroyed to prevent Allied use, Others simply left behind as the evacuation reached its frantic conclusion. Examination of captured German documents and interrogation of prisoners revealed the scale of what had been accomplished: an evacuation of a major military force across a contested waterway in enemy territory, executed with remarkable coordination and speed. Military analysts recognized the achievement for what it was: a skilled operational success by German commanders, even as the larger campaign had concluded in their strategic defeat. This escape across the Strait of Messina haunted Allied commanders for the remainder of the war. Historians and strategists would debate, for decades afterward, whether the Allies could have done more to prevent it, whether different tactics or better coordination might have trapped the German army on Sicily and resulted in a knockout blow to Axis forces in the Mediterranean. Some argued that aggressive naval operations earlier in the campaign might have prevented the evacuation entirely. Others suggested that amphibious landings on the Calabrian shore should have been attempted on a larger scale and with greater force. Yet the reality was that the Germans, having anticipated this moment and prepared for it, possessed significant advantages in terms of interior lines, knowledge of the terrain, and control over the timing of their movement. The Allies, for all their growing military strength, had not yet achieved the absolute mastery of the battlefield that would become their hallmark by 1944. The escape of the German army across the Strait of Messina stood as a reminder that even in victory, there remained aspects of warfare that slipped beyond even the most careful commander's control. By the middle of July, Operation Husky had fundamentally transformed. What began as an uncertain gamble, an ambitious amphibious assault against an Axis-held fortress, had evolved into a race against time. The Allies were no longer fighting merely to establish themselves on Sicily. They were fighting to prevent the wholesale escape of German forces across the Strait of Messina. That narrow waterway, barely 3 kilometers at its widest point, had become the barrier between a strategic triumph and a missed opportunity that would haunt Allied commanders for months to come. General Patton's 7th Army, driving relentlessly northward along Sicily's western coast, was locked in a desperate competition with General Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the southeast. Both commanders understood what was at stake. Whoever reached Messina first would claim victory, but more importantly, they might yet trap the German divisions that had fought with such skill and determination throughout the campaign. The clock was ticking, and every hour counted as German commanders made the fateful calculations that would determine their army's fate. By the 16th of July, American spearheads had fought their way to Messina's outskirts, exhausted and bloodied after 13 days of nearly continuous combat across some of the island's most difficult terrain. The city itself gleamed before them across a final stretch of scorched earth and rubble, tantalizingly close, yet desperately far away. German defensive positions ringed the city's approaches with the precision and lethality that had become the hallmark of Wehrmacht rearguard tactics throughout the retreat northward. Machine gun nests interlocked in overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank guns commanded every avenue of approach. Mortar and artillery positions, carefully sited in the hills overlooking the coastal road, rained shells down upon any American attempt to advance. The Germans were not attempting to hold Messina permanently. They were buying time with measured violence, trading space and casualties in exchange for hours. Hours needed to complete the evacuation of their remaining forces across the strait. The American advance, which had swept across Sicily with almost contemptuous speed, came to an abrupt and grinding halt against this disciplined resistance. The soldiers who had fought from Gela to the gates of Messina found themselves stalled, unable to break through the final German cordon, reduced to artillery duels and cautious probing attacks that gained only yards at tremendous cost. Meanwhile, British and Canadian forces were grinding forward from the southeast. Having pursued Montgomery's methodical northeastward advance toward Messina for nearly 2 weeks, their progress had been slower than Patton's dramatic western sweep, constrained by mountainous terrain, limited roads that could support armored columns, and the German habit of establishing carefully prepared defensive positions across every natural choke point. The British fought with their characteristic determination and professionalism, but the nature of the terrain and German resistance meant that speed and audacity, Patton's weapons, were less effective here than careful coordination and sustained pressure. Montgomery pushed his forces forward in the knowledge that his American counterpart was competing for the same objective, adding a layer of intensity to the campaign that transcended military necessity. 2 armies, 2 commanders, and the pride of their respective nations all converged on a single point of geography, Messina. The race had become as much about honor and national prestige as it was about military strategy. Yet beneath the competitive tension lay a grimmer reality. German forces, despite their fighting withdrawal, were slipping away across the strait with each passing hour, and neither army was going to be able to prevent it. The German command structure, under the supervision of General Hasso von Manteuffel and his subordinates, had transformed Sicily's invasion into something far more manageable than the catastrophic defeat that might have occurred. What had begun as a potential encirclement and destruction of Axis forces had become instead a fighting retreat, orderly, disciplined, and disturbingly effective. German logistics officers and transport commanders had established a ferry system across the Strait of Messina, using everything that could float: destroyers, transport vessels, ferries, tugboats, and hastily converted cargo ships. Darkness became their ally. The waters of the strait, particularly once night fell, offered concealment from Allied air superiority. German anti-aircraft units, positioned on both sides of the strait, created a protective umbrella that made daylight aerial interdiction increasingly costly and ineffective. The evacuation was not merely a desperate scramble. It was becoming increasingly organized as the days progressed, with German logistics elements establishing assembly areas, loading sequences, and embarkation schedules. Wave after wave of troops were being ferried across the narrow water, along with vehicles, artillery, and supplies. The tempo of the evacuation accelerated, as German commanders judged their withdrawal nearly complete and authorized one final coordinated effort to clear the remaining forces from Sicily before the Allies could consolidate control of the island. The human drama of those final hours before Messina fell reflected the entire campaign's larger arc: desperation meeting determination, exhaustion meeting resolve. American troops, many of whom had been in continuous combat for nearly 2 weeks, with minimal rest and constant strain, pressed forward against objectives that seemed to recede even as they advanced. Young soldiers, some barely out of their teens, found themselves in assault formations moving through rubble-strewn streets, clearing German positions with grenades and small arms fire, taking casualties from machine gun fire that seemed to emerge from every ruined building and every rocky outcropping. The heat of the Mediterranean summer bore down on them mercilessly. Their supplies of water were inadequate for the intensity of combat and the oppressive climate. Yet they advanced, driven by the knowledge that the war was entering a new phase, that Sicily was nearly finished, and that the victory they could see before them was within their grasp if they could only push forward a little further. British soldiers faced similar conditions from their approach routes, fighting through terrain that seemed designed by nature itself to exhaust and consume human strength. The mountains around Messina rose steeply, roads switchbacked endlessly. German artillery observers positioned on high ground could call down fire with devastating accuracy on any column that attempted to advance along the narrow ways. On the 17th of July, the barrier finally broke. American forces, having pressured German positions relentlessly and concentrated sufficient firepower to overwhelm the last organized resistance, pushed into Messina's outskirts and then into the city itself. British forces entered from the eastern approach almost simultaneously, meeting American units in the city's streets in a convergence that marked the completion of Operation Husky's stated territorial objective. The city that had seemed unreachable hours before was now in Allied hands. Yet the mood among the soldiers who entered Messina was complicated, far removed from the triumphalism that might have been expected from a victorious army entering an enemy city. The German army, or at least the bulk of it, had escaped. The streets of Messina were nearly empty of German soldiers. Most had already crossed the strait, or were in the process of doing so during the final hours before the city fell. What the Allies had captured was geography and real estate, but they had failed to achieve the complete victory that encirclement and destruction of German forces would have represented. German rearguard elements, fighting from prepared positions until the very last moment, had bought enough time for their comrades to reach the ferries and make the crossing into Calabria. Messina had fallen, but the Germans had escaped, and that fact would shape the subsequent campaign in Italy and beyond. The final evacuation across the Strait of Messina represented one of the Wehrmacht's most impressive tactical achievements. A disciplined fighting withdrawal in the face of overwhelming Allied pressure, executed with sufficient skill and determination to prevent encirclement and destruction. The narrow waters of the strait, only 3 kilometers wide, had been transformed into a contested boundary that German forces managed to cross with their essential fighting strength largely intact. Destroyers and other warships, operating under cover of darkness and German air support, transported thousands of troops across nightly. Smaller vessels, including ferries and transport ships, carried vehicles and supplies. The Allies threw what resources they could into attempting to interdict this flow. Air raids attempted to sink transport vessels in daylight hours, but German anti-aircraft defenses and fighter cover inflicted such heavy losses that the sorties became progressively less effective. American and British attempts at amphibious landings on the Calabrian side of the strait, intended to cut the crossing routes and trap German forces, were repulsed by German defenders, who seemed to multiply and harden even as their comrades withdrew. The result was an evacuation that, while not achieving the speed or preservation of equipment that German commanders would have preferred, nonetheless succeeded in saving the bulk of German fighting personnel. Approximately 100,000 German troops made the crossing, along with thousands of vehicles, significant quantities of artillery, and sufficient supplies to make the continuation of the war in Italy viable. The strategic implications of this German escape were profound and immediately apparent to the highest levels of Allied command. General Eisenhower and his senior staff had envisioned the conquest of Sicily as the prelude to a rapid collapse of Italian resistance and potentially the swift conquest of southern Italy. Instead, German tactical skill and the geographical advantages provided by the Strait of Messina had permitted the Wehrmacht to establish a foothold on mainland Italy that would prove extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. The soldiers who escaped across the strait would fight again, would contest every valley and hillside on the Italian peninsula, and would inflict casualties on the Allies that would mount substantially as the months progressed. Military historians have long debated whether a more aggressive strategy at Messina Perhaps a commitment of greater resources to amphibious interdiction or a more concentrated effort to prevent German evacuation might have altered this outcome. What remains beyond dispute is that German forces, despite the overall tactical defeat represented by their withdrawal from Sicily, managed to preserve their combat effectiveness in a way that would prove consequential. The escape across the strait meant that Operation Husky's victory, while territorially complete, remained strategically incomplete. The campaign to knock Italy out of the war would be far longer and far more costly than initial Allied planning had suggested. The soldiers who had fought across Sicily in those 38 days emerged from Messina's fall with a complicated mixture of emotions. For the men of the 7th Army and the 8th Army, the arrival at Messina represented the culmination of months of planning, training, and sacrifice. They had executed an amphibious invasion of unprecedented scale against a defended coast, had consolidated a precarious beachhead against furious Axis counterattacks, and had then fought inland across terrain that ranged from coastal plains to mountain wilderness. They had endured heat, hunger, exhaustion, and fear in equal measure. The campaign had cost them friends and fellow soldiers. Thousands of American and British troops had been killed or wounded in Sicily. Yet from their perspective, the objective had been achieved. Messina had fallen. Sicily was in Allied hands. The invasion had succeeded. The operation had proven that large-scale amphibious assaults against defended coastlines could succeed, that American and British forces could fight together effectively, and that the Axis, for all its military skill, could be driven back and defeated. These lessons, learned in the heat of Sicilian combat, would prove vital in the months and years ahead. The men who fought at Gela, Messina, and 1,000 points between them had demonstrated a capacity for coordinated warfare that extended far beyond the Mediterranean. Yet the escape of German forces also reinforced lessons about